Work this time? Yeah, I think it worked this time. Okay. Alrighty. Make sure this is on. I think I'm finally live now after some connection fun there. So hopefully people can make their way in. It's always fun trying to jump on these things and get going. Uh, so anybody who's hopping in, let me know that I'm actually coming through okay, because I had some fun trying to get the connection up. Oh, hi, Ronald. Hey, man. Yeah, there I am. I don't know what it is. I thought, oh, if I just jump on, that'll work. And that worked last time, but this time it didn't. So it acted like it was working. And then it just was like, no, you're not doing anything. So I'm still trying to figure out something else different, but it seems like every time I jump on, I never know if it's going to work. Don't jump. Yeah. So while that was loading, I tried to fix my shelves. I don't know why my webcam always wants to blow out the light behind me, so it looks like I usually have my Eastwood Blu-ray box set right here, and it's white. So I tried moving some stuff around, so it's a little better, but do bear with me. It's really hard to get the lighting right for these because again, my webcam just wants to make everything go like wow. So, oh hey Garrick, hey man, yeah, the cursed live streams, yeah. I know it's not just me though, because I saw some bigger channels have trouble with some of their live streams because I saw at least part of a couple this past weekend, and I know one of them had the same trouble I usually do. Like he had to stop and start another one. And I'm like, it's not just me, yay! So at first I was like, does YouTube hate me? Did I do something? So yes, I moved the Clint. Well, he's still right here, but I don't know. Whoops. Wow, I'm already knocking stuff. I don't know what you call these. I kind of refer to them as the shoebox, but yeah, my UK box. As you can see, it already wants to blow it out like crazy. I have to do it at an angle. So I thought maybe that was what was causing it to go super crazy in the back. But as you can see, it automatically wants to it's going to do what it will. So yes, he was on the floor because I was doing this because I was like, oh, it's just loading. And then I realized, oh no, it's doing the usual spinning circle of doom. Got a new one. Anonymous Fowler, thanks for joining in. Oh, yes. Walking the dog is always super important. Yes. Thanks for dropping in for a bit. So, as everybody's kind of making their way in, I wanted to throw this together, and I was trying to come up with another October themed topic. And last year I did pretty much all my big ones, and then I realized, I haven't really. Well, I kind of covered him in the Universal Horrors section because he's pretty much the genius of Universal Horror, but I hadn't talked about James Whale in particular yet, and Whale is one of my. I'll just say he's one of my heroes. He's one of my great. If you make the list of the people you would like to meet from the past, or like the great artists you would like to meet, like the 5 or 10 people, Jimmy Whale would be in there. And when you see his major films, it's one of those times you really get that sense that you kind of know the person. I mean, not that you really would, but you do get that sense because so much of his personality is in there. And I think I don't really put a lot of stock on the auteur theory. I think it's been bastardized to the point of insanity because the director does not do everything. But if there was one person that could actually prove that, it would be James Whale, and during his tenure at Universal, where he had a creative freedom that few ever had. He did have a creative freedom kind of on the level of what Orson Welles had on Citizen Kane with his amazing, art contract. Because essentially the head of the studio, Carl Laemmle Jr., was his patron of sorts. So for those few short, that is roughly a 5-year period, 1931 to 1936, he had a level of creative freedom that most people couldn't even begin to dream of. So it's a magical bunch of films, and particularly the 4 horror films, because unfortunately most of his other films are ridiculously hard to find. There's no video release, or you gotta watch some terrible uploaded version on YouTube, like for Journey's End, for example, which is just ridiculous. I do believe there is one coming out from Kino this year on Blu-ray, which is really great news. But you're pretty much stuck with watching, the 4 horror films over and over, and listening to the documentary pieces and commentaries. And then there's 1 or 2 others which I'll talk about. But unfortunately, the vast majority of his body of work is, missing on home video. But let's see, we got some more stuff. Oh, we only got a 4K panel. Excellent, sir. 55-inch. Yeah, that's basically that sweet spot. If you go over that, your price is going to jump dramatically. And we would love to have 90-inch TVs, but we don't really need them. Now to find a 4K laser display, yeah, that's where you got to start getting into the Peter Biancardi wizardry with upscalers and stuff. Some TVs do actually pretty decently. I think the Sonys, everybody says, have some really good results just running straight composite. So you might get lucky and you might get decent results. But yeah, you'll probably have to start playing around with some scaling equipment and stuff. If you've got a good system inside your receiver, some of them, like mine, has the I have the old Onkyo 626, and it's got the Marvell QDO. I think that's how you say it, QDEO. But it's got the Marvell QDO 4K upscaler that I've just tested at 1080p, and it's ridiculously good for LD. So if you've got a receiver, chances are you've got some sort of upscaler built in. Wolf's here. Hey, man. Have I ever seen Waterloo Bridge? Yes. Well, I'm actually going to get to that. Of course, the reason most people haven't seen it is MGM did a remake and bought up the rights. You couldn't see the original. I think it was actually almost thought lost at some point, but MGM did that a lot, just like they did on their the Victor Fleming remake of Jekyll and Hyde. They bought up and suppressed the original 1931 Mamoulian version with Freddie March. And of course, they did the same thing on Gaslight and suppressed the British film, and that was almost lost. And now a lot of people think it's better than the George Cukor version, so on and so forth. And of course, Warner Archive is releasing the remake on Blu-ray, and it's like, well, that's nice. Can we get the whale version, please? I'm going to get to it in a little bit when I start going over some of the video copies, but it's like, I would love to see it in HD, guys. Could we make it a twofer, maybe? I'm sure it's probably an Elements issue, because I'm sure if there was like a super good Element, they probably would have just made like a double feature set for the Blu-ray release, so you could get both versions of the same story. Inboard's here. Hey there. Gonna go buy some James Whale titles after this on Laserdisc. That's a good idea. I have a couple. I don't have all of them. With the horrors, they've gone through the the Universal Blu-ray restorations. So I can't necessarily recommend going all the way back to LD, but it is kind of cool seeing what they were like back in the day. And I was actually quite surprised looking at some of those again this year, because it's Halloween. Not only do I just gorge on classic horror films, but I actually look at all my various copies, and so I've been looking at some of the older LD versions and stuff. Yeah, they still have good LDs. Of course, they're mostly the encore editions, so like it's analog sound only on Dracula, Frankenstein, and Bride, but they still look quite good. But yeah, what they achieved on those restorations, they're not perfect, but I mean, you never in a million years did you think that they could look that good on video for all of them, just because the wear and tear and everything. But the one in particular that you need to get on Blu-ray, because the old disc is so crummy, because they had a really crummy source, is Old Dark House. The restoration on Old Dark House, oh my God, it's like seeing a brand new film. It looks better than all the other Universal horror Blu-rays combined. I mean, it's astonishing, especially since, for years and years and years, all we had was the LD master, and then Kino ported it to DVD, and it was like based off a doopy 16 millimeter print, and it was so dark, and it was so sad to see it that way. But because it was nearly a lost film, and it was unavailable for many, many years, again because somebody remade it and suppressed it. We had the I mean, yeah, it's kind of fun in certain ways, but the 1963 Old Dark House, it's just, yeah, it's not even, you can't even mention them in the same sentence. But because of that, the original was suppressed and almost completely lost. Had it not been for Curtis Harrington, actually making the efforts to save it. But the new 4K restoration is just again. I'll get to that in a minute when I'm talking about some of the video editions. But that's one of those times where I'm like, yeah, I would like to get the LD. I'll still get it at some point because I'm obsessed with this film. But it's one of the times where you've got to see the new restoration. I mean, I about fell on the floor when I saw it for the first time. It's the only Cohen disc I have because Cohen usually is a very pricey label. Their releases are usually like, 35, 40, $50. And I bought it day of release. I never do that. I always wait for sales. I'm like, no, no. If there's any chance it's better than the Kino DVD, I got to do it. And I'm so glad I did because my goodness, every year, because it's been about 2.5, maybe 3 years now. And every time I pull it off the shelf, it's like, oh my God, I forgot. Oh, this is just too beautiful. So anyway, let's see what else we got here. See the massive Clint Eastwood box set from the UK looks about the size of the Ford Fox box set. No, I don't think I have actually. Is it like a repackaging of all the previous issued discs like Warner used to do in those big boxes? I think they did a big Eastwood box for DVD. No, no, they did one for Blu-ray too, but it was just like a repackaging of stuff. And of course, Kino's been doing the new discs. Some are new scans, like 2K and 4K scans. Otherwise, they're just reissuing the old masters, but with commentaries and stuff. But you know, for the money, you can't beat this thing because this UK set, has all the titles. Some of the transfers are a little problematic, but they're okay. And I got this for less than $10, and it has Breezy in it, which was not available in the US until Kino just put it out like literally last month. So some of these are outdated now, of course, but you can still get this nice package for literally next to nothing. And then some of these masters on those Kino discs are the same. They reuse some of them. Let's see. Oh, Garrick's in the middle of a Universal marathon. Excellent. Yeah, I'm smack dab in the middle of my stuff. I've been like I said, some of them I've gone for the new Blu-rays, and I've mixed in some of the new titles I've gotten because I'm like I need to wait and save this for Halloween. So I'm like doing like a loose chronological order. So I'm like at the tail end of the 30s, made it through the golden age and the pre-code horrors. But I've never quite done it this way before, where I started with the silence and worked my way through the golden age horrors and the 30s Universal films. And it's a mixture. Like some I have on LD, some are DVD, some are Blu-ray. But some of them I've gone back. Like I watched Dracula and Frankenstein on the Encore LDs, which was a really cool thing to jump all the way back and be like, okay, yeah, this is more like I remember it growing up. And the transfer on Frankenstein was really impressive, actually. So yeah, I just did Son of Frankenstein, and then I splurged a bit. I couldn't resist. I'm also mixing in a few others. So the last I watched, I ran the Warner Archive Blu-ray of Thing from Another World, which is, I mean, that's a stunning disc for just for the element problems they had to deal with, because they postponed it for a long time because they were like, we can't make good enough Blu-ray. The DVD was as good as we could do. And so they waited and waited and waited. So it's actually really impressive. And I guess I should talk about recent spins since I'm already kind of going over that. Just a few. So of course, the Warner Archive release of The Thing from Another World. If you don't have a copy of this film, get this Blu-ray. I mean, the work they did is stunning. You can tell there are some sections, if you're really looking, that look, kind of rough and blown out a little bit, but that's because the elements they were having to use, it's like a composite print basically of a bunch of different sources. So this is really the best they could do, but the work they did, unless you're looking for it, you're not really going to spot it. It's actually quite seamless in a lot of ways. I was really impressed looking at this. I've had this for a little while. I spot checked it when I got it, but I wanted to save it for October, even though it is much more on the science fiction side of things. But of course, original poster art. It does include what's really cool. It includes an HD trailer finally, but it's got Spanish subtitles. So they found this old Spanish trailer and managed to like sync the English audio to it, or maybe I think it was just subtitled in Spanish, maybe. But it's really cool to actually see a version of the trailer in HD. So that was a nice little extra they put on there because most of these, it's just carrying over DVD extras. They don't really make new ones. That being said, on this next one, they did. And again, this was another one that I had to put on as soon as I got it because I never thought this would happen in a million years on Blu-ray. This particular disc corrects one of the worst DVDs ever made that we were stuck with for a long time. And the reason I say that is because it totally screwed up the color, and the color is a very important part of this film. So I'm already making my list of the best discs of the year, and I don't think anything's going to top this. So it's no secret. I think this will be the best uh, physical disc release of 2020, and that is Warner Archives' release of 1933's Mystery of the Wax Museum, the second of the two-strip Technicolor pre-code horror films directed by Michael Curtiz. Of course, remade famously as House of Wax, but in a lot of ways, this is still the superior film. But it is an astonishing disc. The UCLA restoration on this is just it's like you're seeing it brand new. And then the work they did on the audio as well, because the audio was severely damaged. This was thought lost for a long time. They found a lone color print in Jack Warner's storage vault years after his death. But what made this possible is they managed to find a French print of sorts to use as a second source. And so they managed to take care of almost all of the frame jumps, the splices, all the dirty, nasty, awful stuff, and actually do a really amazing job on the audio as well. And this actually includes some really nice extras. There's a 20-minute piece with Fay Ray's daughter, who wrote a great book about her parents' relationship and their careers, which I highly recommend if you haven't read it. And then there's a nice piece where Scott McQueen, the great historian, goes over some of the restoration process. And then he provides a commentary which matches his great Dr. X commentary. Dr. X being the first of the two-strip horror films. And then the Alan Rode, who wrote the great Curtiz biography, does the other one. So this is a Warner Archive disc with great new features. If you have not gotten this yet, this is a must own. Again, I think this is probably the best disc release of 2020. What's even better about this is the DVD screwed up the color so badly that two strip basically provided tones of red and green, and then whatever combination you could make of the two. So it gives all the horror films a very eerie quality. But when they did the DVD, which they put as a bonus on House of Wax, which is also on the House of Wax Blu-ray, they screwed up the color so bad that all the greens were blue, and the brightness was just messed up horribly. And that was the first way I got to see this. And I'm like, why does this look so weird? So you had to go back to the old Laserdisc set, which was paired with Dr. X, to see a version correct. But either one, it was still really, really rough. So they did an astonishing job with this. And supposedly they're going to be doing Dr. X. So hopefully that comes out sometime next year so we can, double feature these, because it's really weird watching Dr. X. It looked pretty decent, but in standard definition, and then going to this, where it's just like, oh my God. So yes, this is a must own if you have not gotten it yet. If you've never seen it, this and Dr. X, they're really one of a kind. They're the only two pre-code horror films that are in two-strip Technicolor, and these were really the last huzzah for two-strip. So I don't think there's a better looking two-strip feature than this or Dr. X, because they look like nothing else. And then lastly, I'm going to be doing a review on this, but I was so happy to get this because I wanted to get the Shout Factory box sets, but they're ridiculously expensive. And then Eureka announced this for their Masters of Cinema line. So this is spine number 233 through 235. Their release of, they basically group them as Poe films, but it's the three adaptations of Poe done by Universal in the classic horror period, all starring Bela Lugosi, two of them with Karloff, of course, featuring Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Black Cat, and The Raven. This is the deluxe package that has the lovely booklet and really awesome flip cover. This ports over the commentaries from the Scream Factory release, but on theirs you have to buy Volume 1 and then buy Murders in the Rue Morgue separately. But those releases are really expensive. It's kind of hard doing those. They've gotten up to Volume 6 now, but there's 4 films per set. They're all about slightly over an hour long. Yes, they have some commentaries, which are great, but the $60 or $70 retail price that gets charged for those is just way too much to afford. And I'm a big fan of Masters of Cinema. Usually their encoding's better. This got announced, and you get the most famous three of these lesser known non-monster universal horrors for like half the price of one of those sets. But let me take this off so you can see. What's nice is they actually did a MOC style jacket sleeve for each film. So here's one for Rue Morgue. Here's a nice shot of the Great Pair of Horror. Let me take this out so you can see. But here's the one for the Black Cat. And here's the one for the Raven. And then I set the booklet over somewhere. I can't reach it right now. But so it does have a really nice booklet. But honestly, the main selling point of this is, in addition to having some nice new little extras, there's a really cool 30-minute piece with Kim Newman, who is always great talking about classic horror. But the real selling point of this, and why you should buy it too, it's not listed on here, but this actually includes the reconstructed version of Murders in the Rue Morgue, which, if you've never heard of it or you've never seen it, it's been debated in fan circles and horror circles for a long time. But Murders in the Rue Morgue was one of the handful of classic Universal films that had some manipulation go on and some additional shots put in and some edits made. So the theatrical version has moments that make no sense. There's a lot of weird cuts. If you've ever wondered why this film is so kind of weird, it's because it's been chopped up and moved around quite a bit. And so about 5-10 years ago, during the DVD era, some fans on the horror forums were discussing, after a Video Watchdog article came out about, how could you possibly reconstruct the film? So they went through a couple versions, and they finally hit upon this one where everything seemed to make sense. And so when Shout Factory announced their release, I'm like, oh, hopefully it'll have the reconstructed version, because they did it as a standalone disc, and nothing. They didn't even say anything or bother with it whatsoever. So this is not listed. It's hidden as an Easter egg. But what they did was they actually went in and, took the beautiful Universal Master and everything and conformed it to the consensus agreed reconstruction version. So the opening is different, the whole flow of the picture suddenly makes sense, the editing makes sense, there's not those random shots inserted in weird places. Everything else is the same. No scenes are removed per se. It's still the same film, but it makes the viewing experience much more pleasurable. And that should be like on the front of the box. That's the biggest point about this. So I cannot recommend this highly enough. If you've never seen these three films, they are the three key non-monster Universal films of the 30s. And again, since they're all pre-code, they are, very lurid, very dark. The Black Cat was so out there that when apparently the Limleys came back from vacation or wherever they were, and they saw what Edgar G. Ulmer had done, they were like, we can't release this, even though the code isn't in effect yet. So they recut it, reshot it, and turned Lugosi's character into the sympathetic hero of the film of sorts, which is a real change, and another reason why the finished version is so amazing to see. Not only is it the first pairing of Karloff and Lugosi, not only is it atmospheric as all get out, not only is it a film full of sacrifice, torture, necrophilia, alcoholism, pathological brutality, and malevolent black humor, but Lugosi's actually the good guy. So it's very bizarre to see for the first time. And then The Raven is basically the flip side, where it's much more of a B film, but it is Lugosi at his best, all-out madman as a Poe-obsessed fanatic who has built an entire chamber of horrors in his basement, and then decides to take his revenge on those he feels who has wronged him, and is actually the film that was so dark that it caused the British censors to get the horror ban put in place in Britain, which is what killed off the golden age of horror. So The Raven is the film that was apparently so dark in 1935 that it instigated the British horror ban and made Universal and MGM and Paramount and everybody go, oh, we should stop making these because the British are an important market. And if they don't want these horror films, well, we can't make money off of them. So it's very important historically. And I do think this Masters of Cinema package is the definitive way to go. I really hope they do more of them because this is a lovely set. And again, worth the $35 purchase alone simply for having the reconstruction of Murders in the Rue Morgue. So that's my recent spins. Let's see. Ooh, got a lot of stuff. Let me scroll back through these real quick. Oh, Brian's here. Hey, man. Oh, not getting the notification. Thank you for checking. I hope that stuff's working. I'll double check on that stuff. Thing is a nice release, nice carrot. Yeah. You mean to say he's like a living carrot? Rumored that Warner Archive might go 4K UHD upon approval from the higher ups. Yeah, I don't see how they why they wouldn't. And wait, hi 4K. How's it going? Yeah, I think they could do like one-offs. I don't see why they couldn't do some UHD discs and keep continuing on with the Blu-ray releases, but yeah, it's possible they might become the entire 4K catalog wing. And to be honest, I wouldn't mind that because they do such a better job. So even if there's no extras or anything, it's like, oh, they keep saying, North by Northwest might come to 4K. Well, it's like, can Warner Archive do it, please? Because you guys suck at the studio line. Like, we're lucky. Oh, that's always fun. We're lucky if there's a decent encode, but they usually goof something up, particularly with those new animation releases. Like the Flintstones one is okay, but it's got some issues and they cram some stuff onto too few discs. But you compare the Warner Archive releases, they're going to do Space Ghost next, but they did the Jetsons, maxed out bit rates, multiple disc. The Johnny Quest release they did was astonishing. That was my Blu-ray of 2019, best disc of the year. Spread across 3 discs. Absolutely staggering quality. And then you get to Scooby-Doo, which was on the main studio line, and they crammed them onto 4 BD25s and added some DNR and lossy audio and that house package that's like still $90 for all the swag you don't want. And I'm like, why is this so hard? But yeah, I don't see why they wouldn't, even if it's just certain ones will get the UHD treatment. But yeah, that would be amazing. Brian crammed in all creature films last night. Firm believer they survived somehow. Yes, Gilsey made it. You got to feel that little bit of hope, and it's like the last bits of Creature Walks Among Us. It's like maybe he made it. Maybe he made it all the way back to his original home, where it was like if people had just left him alone. It's like those are sad in the way of he didn't do anything wrong. People just kept coming into his house, and then they captured him and dragged him off to Marineland, and then they surgically altered him, and he's just like, what the hell, man? I was just doing my thing. Hope we get a Dr. X announcement soon. Yes. Hopefully, yes. I don't know about you, but I need my synthetic flesh and hopefully in 4K, but at least in HD. Eric's here. Yeah, hey man. May go all Hammer horror all night Saturday. Yeah, I'm saving Hammer till last. I'm still waiting on. Ordered a couple discs for the Shout Factory sale because they did all those great Hammer discs, but I loaded up on a few I hadn't gotten yet, and then they're doing Brides of Dracula in November, which is the big one because all the past versions have been screwy. So the DVD is the only good version, and it's supposed to be a new scan. And so I'm like, fingers crossed, guys. So I'm gonna do Hammer last, and so as usual, I'm always running into November. So because of that, I'm still waiting on those other discs to come in. I'm gonna be like, okay, I'm gonna save Hammer till last, and then do the all the main Hammers and look at some of the new Blu-rays I haven't looked at yet. Oh, Wolf got the MOC set. Awesome. Yeah, it's a really, really great piece. And again, I think it's I do think it's better than the Shout set, and again, half the price. But of course, Shout has done more films, and they're up to 6 volumes. And I'm really hoping that MOC does more. Eureka is actually going to do the Inner Sanctum films, which is great. Here, they're just going to be on Mill Creek, which is great because those need to be done. They need to be on Blu-ray as well because they are a part of Universal's history. But it's really cool that Eureka is doing them over there, and it's going to have some new extras and stuff. So I'm really excited to check that out. Um, let's see. Oh, Sega's here. Hey, man. Uh, oh, you didn't get the notification either. Oh, darn. I'll have to look at that then. I don't know. It may have been because I had trouble connecting at first, and it wouldn't want to work on the first one, so I had to do that second one. Maybe it's just because my usual connection issues. um, oh, Eric didn't know about the MOC set. Yeah, no, I must have it. Yes. Eureka's running a sale on horror titles right now, like a 2 for £20, but it's just like selected ones. This one is still, hold this up again. So this is still, their limited edition, so it's a little bit more expensive. There are a couple that pop up on eBay, so there are some US sellers with copies of this. But if you order it from Eureka, it's still, I think it's still $27.99 in pounds. I think Amazon UK is a little cheaper, and they've kind of opened up their US shipping. But you might want to check. There are some that have popped up from US sellers on eBay if you're really wanting to get this. Hopefully, sometime before or during Halloween. But yes, this is a must. Seeing a physical release of the reconstruction of Murders in the Rue Morgue, it's like, oh my god! But again, it's an Easter egg, so I don't know if it was something they did without asking Universal or something. But that's the main selling point of this whole thing is you could see the version that opens, with the ship passing by and the knife fight and everything, the Bride of Science scene, all that stuff, long before you get to the carnival opening, which is how the theatrical cut opens. So yes, this is an amazing set. Let's see. Oh, Brian missed the last stream and almost this. Not sure why no notification. I will. Yeah, I'll try and figure that out. I didn't know it was messing up. Sometimes it's just one of those weird things that apparently we have no control over. So, as always, it's a learning process. So I'll see if I can't figure that out. But I'll make another help ticket. Let's see. So the censorship was our fault. Sorry, guys. Well, yeah. Well, not your fault. It's the British Censor Board and that 1935 horror ban. So basically, that's why Dracula's Daughter in 36 was the last Universal horror film of the Golden Age. Oh, Anonymous Fowler, and those were never officially released here, so I'll just have to buy bootleg DVDs. Oh, that sucks. Yeah, at least nowadays it's easier to import stuff than it was, back even 5-10 years ago. But yeah, that it still sucks that there's so many territories where there's no good official releases, and it's like, well, what do you do? you know I almost did get stuff in the Criterion Flash sale, but I've been hit by a number of sales. It seemed like everybody decided it was time to murder my wallet for October, which was like, oh crap. Let's see. There was Shout had their sale, and they sold out of stuff before I could finish my order, so I missed out on half the stuff I was going to get. Kino's sale is still running. Arrow is doing a sale on their UK site. Criterion had a flash sale. Criterion's supposed to do, I think, a Barnes & Noble half-off sale in November, so that's another one coming up. And then who else was it? Amazon had some sales. So many new releases I was trying to look at. So it was just I was having to pick and choose. And then I went to the record convention in the middle of all of that because they had their first one since COVID had happened. So it was just like, yeah, I'm gonna have to pick and choose. So I got most of the stuff that I wanted to get in the Shout sale because when they have a sale, it's even bigger savings a lot of times than what Criterion has because Shout's prices are so expensive to begin with. Oh, 4K saying the new Eastwood box set is all films from all studios, including stuff like Paint Your Wagon. Oh, so it's like a big coffee table art piece set. Okay. That makes sense comparing it to Ford at Fox. Ronald says, when I was young, I saw a movie that was scary up till the scary monster appeared, and I laughed and changed the channel, and from hell it came. Yeah. Oh man, those are always fun, especially or if you see something you were scared as when you were a kid, and then you see it years later, and you're like, oh god, I was terrified of that, and then you're like, should I even watch this? And then you watch like the first 5 minutes, you're like, oh my god, why? How was I? How was I ever fooled by this? Um, oh, cool, Daisuke's here. Hello, sir. I'm at work at the moment, but let me stop by. Oh, thank you, sir. Oh, greetings. Hello. So happy to see you here. I have the same problem. Just this weekend, I was working, and there was yours and two other live streams I saw part of, and so it's always hard trying to squeeze in stuff where you see somebody on live, and you're like, oh goodness, I got to check them out. Cheers, sir. Let's see. Eric got the UK box set of The Shining earlier this year. Lovely. Finally got to see the shorter British cut. Yeah, the British cut is a real interesting piece when you look at it for the first time. Especially if you're used to the American, 144-minute long version. And I still don't. I mean, I would think the long version is the definitive one, but Kubrick kept tinkering around with the edit, and he thought that British audiences would react differently, and plus it came out later there, it gave him more time to tinker. And he would do that at the end stages or even during release. So 2001, he re-edited, Sailing Over for the LA premiere. And then after the premiere dates, another 15 minutes was dropped. The Shining famously had the ending removed from the first prints and a few other little tweaks. So if you saw it at the premiere engagements in the US, you saw it with the original ending with the hospital and everything. So yeah, it's a different experience, but I miss all the stuff from the American version. So I've seen the British one like twice, and both times it's been like, oh yeah, that's it. Oh wait, no, that's missing here. And so it's like it's one of those. I'm cool it exists. I'm happy that it exists. I'm happy that there's a version on video, but it's one of those times where I'm like, yeah, no, I miss all the good stuff. Let's see. Oh, Elvin's here. Hello, sir. Have all the Hammer Indicator 5 volumes, but still picking up the Mill Creek box set because those films will be different than the Shout Factory ones and no crossovers. Yeah, it's the big Mill Creek Hammer box. Basically, it's like the big grab bag of other titles, and most of the Indicator releases haven't come out here on disc yet in terms of HD. So it's nice for people who haven't gotten those. Unfortunately, I've only gotten volume 4 of the Indicators so far, and volume 1 is out of print, and I'm like kicking myself that I didn't get it already. So I've got to get the rest of those because man, those things are just, man, the quality there. Their disc of Revenge of Frankenstein alone is just, my God, it's like that's one of the best Blu-rays I've ever seen. And Indicator is just an amazing label, and I wish their shipping wasn't as expensive as it is on their website. Otherwise, I would probably be ordering from them a lot more. But I think I've just got to bite the bullet and start buying from them more because my goodness, they do the most amazing work. That new Fu Manchu box set, I've never really seen any of those particular films, the Christopher Lee Fu Manchu films, but the amount of work they put in and how good they look, I'm like, my goodness, that's another one. It's like add to wish list immediately. But yeah, they're just left and right. They're not, a quantity label. Everything they put out is like has the most ridiculous level of quality put into it. So yeah, all their box sets are amazing. Brian says, "Love the Raven because that's really a Lugosi film, even though Karloff received top billing." And yeah, that's Bela's show throughout. He gets to not just have the better role, he gets to dominate Karloff for really the only time, and he gets to go full tilt. And he's not being hammy or anything. I mean, he's legitimately, like, I tear torture from myself by torturing you. You want to know why I love the works of Poe? And then when he builds up to the mad climax and he's just gone completely off the deep end. And Karloff's great too. It's a smaller role, but he does remarkable stuff. Of course, it's a mostly silent role, which of course, befits the great artist of the Frankenstein performance. But I think probably what got the censors most of all, the moment that gets you every time, is the botched plastic surgery when Lugosi lovingly, horribly mutilates Karloff's face and then slowly peels the bandage off and everything. And it's like, there's a lot of influences in comics, but it's like when you look at the Raven, you're like, what does this makeup remind me of? I wonder, because if I am remembering correctly, Two-Face first appeared, I think, in 42 or 40, sometime in the early to mid 40s, so long after the Raven. So pretty sure Two-Face Harvey Dent was well, actually, I think it was Harvey Kent originally in the first appearances, but I'm pretty sure Two-Face's look was totally inspired by the Jack Pierce makeup on the Raven. So that's another one, but that's that moment every time you rewatch that, it's like, oh, you know what's coming, and it's just like, oh yeah. And of course, Lugosi is just like, so yeah. But of course, yeah, Karloff got top billing because he was Karloff, and Bela never got that, which really he should have. But it was really, I think, most of all because Karloff was a very shrewd businessman and very good at, holding out for what he should be paid. Whereas Lugosi, famously on Dracula, just was so desperate he took whatever they gave him and got paid less than any of the other principals, and then everybody just kind of took advantage of that. Whereas Karloff, that's why he didn't do the Invisible Man, because he had a dispute with Universal when they didn't pay him what they were supposed to. When he didn't get the pay raise he was supposed to get contractually, he just walked. And so that's why he was not even considered for the Invisible Man, because he just wasn't there. He's like, nope, I'm gone, guys. So anyway, oh, Just the Discs here. Hello there. Thanks for zipping these Eric of Mers in the Rumork. Yeah, it's not listed. I didn't even know it was there. And then somebody mentioned it on the Blu-ray forums, and I'm like, hey, wait, is that really? And you have to go in there, and you have to go all the way down and then hit left, and it'll highlight the title, Murders in the Rue Morgue, on the menu screen, and that's how you access it. And it's all there, and I'm like, what? And then in the booklet, it has the original Video Watchdog article and the corrections where they first came up with the attempt to reconstruct it. So that way it explains why the scenes are moved around. Let's see. Oh yeah, Dice Guy has been doing these amazing videos. A one for every day of the month, 31 videos about horror titles. Check them out if you haven't already. They're really great pieces. I'm working on something of my own, a little bit different, basically a sort of list video of sorts, because I thought it'd be fun to kind of do a few of those and just do a loose thing and see if I could possibly rank films. But man, it's hard. So I tried to get it down to just 31, like my own personal favorites or top horror films. So I'm still working on that. Hopefully have it up in the next few days. But I also got tired of, you see all the top horror rankings everywhere, and it's like the same stuff and nothing pre 1980. And I'm like, my entire list is like pre 1975. So yeah. So I'm like, I got to do something. I got to get my 2 cents in there. But yeah, Dice Cage series is really great. Just did one on Halloween 3, one on Don't Look Now. A lot of really great titles. A really nice one on even the Twilight Zone. So it's not just films. It's kind of a nice grouping of not just spooky or October, basically kind of Octobery feeling things. And in his wonderful, wonderful style. Let's see. I guess asking about Indicator. That's Indicator is, or I should say, Powerhouse Indicators, the full name, but they're the small British label, very Criterion-like, but they're kind of now like the premier boutique label in the UK for individual quality releases. They're not super huge like Arrow is, and they're not, like super Criterion-y like Masters of Cinema is, but they're like the nice third venue for UK boutique labels, but they have just been knocking out of the park with every single release. They do a lot of elaborate 2 disc sets loaded with extras and multiple cuts. Their box sets are amazing. They've done 5 for Hammer Films now, and a lot of the obscure ones. And now they do a lot of their own scan work. At first, they were just using studio stuff, but Powerhouse Indicator, one of the great labels, easily they do amazing work. Thanks, Dice Cake. Yeah. Yeah, my streams are usually a little long. So I admit it. Usually, like I start talking, I'm like, oh, it's been 45 minutes. No wonder my throat's already getting sore. And then 3-4 hours later, I'm like, oh, I went over again. Whoops. So it's like, oh, like I think I could squeeze in, like 2 or 3 hours. It'll be good. And then look, it's been 4 or 5, and I'm like, well, I overshot it a bit. So, um, fingers hovering over the Fu Manchu. Do I really need those upgrades? Well, if you look at the reviews, man, there is, gosh, they did one of the films in there. They found they said, oh, Reel 3 had damage on the left side, and originally it was just cropped out on the theatrical release. So they actually gave you the option. They captured it, mastered it, and present it both ways. You can watch it cropped on the left like it was always to hide the damage, or you can watch it with all the damage in it. They give you the option, and I'm like, what? Oh my gosh, like that sounds like a disc I would make. Like, that's my level of technical nerdiness. So when I saw that and I saw what the just some of the screenshots looked like, I'm like, I need this. I've never seen any of these, and I need this. My goodness. It just looks amazing. The dice skate came from my impersonations. Oh man. Let's see, what could I do? For one who has not lived even a single lifetime, you are a wise man, Van Helsing. There's so many. Oh, what would be another one? Oh, I thought I was alone. Good evening. Have a cigar. They are my only weakness. Do you know who you are and who Henry Frankenstein is? Yes, I know. Frankenstein make me from dead. I can't really do the creature's voice, but I try anyway. I love dead, hate living. You are wise among your generation. And I can do Ernest Thesiger till the cows come home. But and of course, have a potato, which I should have done at the start anyway. But yeah, the imprint label in Australia has been cranking out some amazing stuff. They did War of the Worlds before Criterion did. I just haven't gotten any of theirs because the cost difference here, makes them like really, really expensive once you add in shipping too. Oh, Ron, I got to see Lugosi's Vampire Ring, actually the film one. Awesome. Yeah, I think he got buried in one of the capes, and I think I think his son still has the other one, which I think has been in a museum once or twice. Thoughts on the spider scene from King Kong? Yeah. Oh, that's like one of the legendary all-time great deleted scenes. It's like, oh, if that existed somewhere, probably would be terrifying, which is why it was removed in that, and the pacing, which I understand why they removed it, but it's like, when you hear Willis O'Brien in interviews say it was like, oh, I wanted to break down and cry. It was some of my best work, and you're like, oh god. And that Peter Jackson recreation on the Kong DVD was like, whoa, that's amazing. Like, him doing that, I'm like, oh, that's great. Why did we need the whole remake? But they went to the ridiculous levels of trying to be period accurate and recreate all the effects. So at least we have some sort of idea of what it looked like. But yeah, I think it would have been it would be terrifying to see in that creepy way that Kong has. But for audiences in 1933, I think it would have totally freaked them out. But I do think pacing wise, because that's during the chase on Skull Island, I can understand why maybe they thought it went on a little bit and kind of distracted some. So I can understand why it was removed for that reason, and also the being a bit too much. But yeah, it'd be amazing to see. For me, the number one, and apparently they didn't shoot it, but It's a moment in Bride of Frankenstein, actually, and for me, it's probably the most. It's like the deleted scene I would give anything to see. Of course, that and the ending of Strangelove with the pie fight. But originally, when Karloff, as the creature's running through and gets to the graveyard before he goes down to the crypt and meets Pretorius. He has to topple the statue of the bishop, and in the background there's a crucifixion statue. And originally, the idea was that the creature sees this figure in torment like himself, and in a gesture of compassion and of self-recognition of someone else in suffering, actually tries to free the statue of Christ from the cross that he's on. Um, and then, obviously realizes that it's not a person, and then just goes on. But that the Hayes office was like, oh hell no, 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 no. And so it's like, oh, but it's like, oh man, what if they shot it? And it's still there if you look. But as Scott McQueen points out in the amazing commentary that he did for that film, what Whale actually had done in the staging, like one of the censored lines, the way it's read, puts the original emphasis back in. If you look, the statue that Karloff actually topples is the statue of a bishop. So it's like, yes, there's the figure of Christ in the background with a beautiful light gazing down on it. But instead of the creature trying to, in a very Christian like way, free the figure that's in torment, actually topples the symbol of organized religion. So it's like even more of like a thumbing the nose. But it's a very subtle thing. It's a blink and you miss it. But I could just, which is another reason of why I totally, absolutely 100% adore James Whale, that he could do something like that, and it's like, ho ho ho, puffing away on a cigar, got him at their own game. But that for me is like one of the great lost moments in any film, because just when I first heard of that, and you see that image in your head, and you're like, oh my god, that would have been amazing. But they would have like gotten the pitchforks out in the 30s over that. um let's see. Oh, Metro's in the house. Hey, man. Uh, it's been pretty good. Good to see you. Oh, thank you. Enjoyed the Batman commentaries. I'm hoping to do some more of those. Those were a lot of fun. Very nerve wracking to do though, because I just go in without any notes and I'm like, totally winging it. But it's kind of cool to give it a go. But I'm thinking about trying to do some more if I can spare some time up. Let's see. Quite a few films of unease as opposed to horror, like Don't Look Now, which I've yet to watch the video for. Yeah, that's what made it so hard making just a top 31 horror films, because I had so many and I had to be like, well, I got to put some clarifications up because otherwise I can't get it down. So I was like, well, maybe I shouldn't do the ones that are like very science fiction-y, and maybe I shouldn't do the ones that are like period, because it's like Witchfinder General is a masterpiece. It gets labeled as a horror film, but it's really not a horror film. So I'm like, I don't know. It doesn't really classify, because that film is basically like, imagine, Barry Lyndon, a couple years early, so 68. So that's, 7 years before Barry Lyndon. Imagine it made on a super low shoestring budget, but extremely dark about the period in time of English history, where with the war going on, there's actual witch burnings going on, and it's one of Vincent Price's great performances. Some say it's his greatest performance, but that is a powerful, staggering work that's extraordinarily dark. It's got one of the great endings of any film, I think. And of course, got, butchered over here in the US and retitled and stuff, but it's not really a horror film. So it's like, it's a masterpiece. It's a film I adore. I watch it every year in October, but it's not really a horror film. So it doesn't really, it doesn't really classify. Don't Look Now is sort of like that as well. Where I think you're right to use the term unease. I know some people during even the golden age of horror hated the term horror, or Vincent Price didn't like the term horror. He preferred, the macabre, which I think is the probably the best term overall for I guess I should say like the loftier films that aren't about gore and blood and guts and stuff. But there's a lot of different theory you can get into. But I think it's interesting that a lot of people kind of picked up on that. And of course, if anything, the James Whale films are all about the macabre. And after Frankenstein, which had a little tiny bit of humor, his humor really comes to full force and just infuses its way through the other three. Oh, Just the Disc is reviewing the Fu Manchu set. Excellent. Yeah, it looks amazing. I just wish I could afford everything. So I have to look at everything and then I have like, well, I'm gonna add it to my list. I'll have to like chip it off where I can, hopefully before it's out of print. No. Yes, highly collectible. Yes. I'm still pissed at myself I didn't get the Hammer Box Volume 1 because now that's, $200 or more on the used market. And I'm like, no. But at least they released the individual films. They usually don't have I don't think they have the booklets, but at least you can still get stuff like, I really wanted to get the release of Dragonwyck, which had a new scan. That's really the first true Vincent Price gothic horror film, the Joe Mankiewicz picture. And it sold out in like, 2 weeks. And I'm like, what? But this is like, a very genre pick. So I couldn't believe it, but it sold out that fast. I'm like, damn. So yeah, they're definitely they've jumped up way far on the collectible scale. I am glad I did get the Five Tall Tales Bodeker and Scott Western box set before that went out of print. That is a beautiful set. Those films they're really icons of American Westerns. They're not talked about enough unless you're a nerd or you're in genre circles. But that was amazing. And that's one of those, I'm like, oh God, I'm so glad I got it before it was gone. Let's see. Oh, Pete's here. Hello, sir. Crusade of Classic Horror continues. Yeah. Yeah, it does sound like a name for a YouTube show. I love Barry Lyndon. Yes. Oh goodness. I can't pick a favorite Kubrick film. I can't pick a best Kubrick film, but there are days where you're like, is this the best one? I think it could be, but I mean, they're all, triumphs, but Barry Lyndon, there's not really another historical film on that level. There's no period film like that before or since. There probably never will be. It's one of a kind. And as much of a shame as it is that we never got Kubrick's Napoleon, I think we did get a good deal out of it, because without the falling apart of Napoleon in the early 70s, we wouldn't have gotten Barry Lyndon. We wouldn't have Kubrick. I've gone, oh, damn it. What do I do now? Hey, I forgot. There's this old book that Thackeray wrote. Hey, this is pretty good. Maybe I could do this. I'm sure it was a lot more fancy and a lot more poetic, and I'm sure it wasn't like that, or maybe it could have been. I don't know. Maybe it just fell off the shelf. He's like, oh hey, I forgot this. But yeah, if it hadn't been for the failure of Napoleon getting off the ground, we wouldn't have gotten Barry Lyndon. So it turned out decently enough. I think James Whale might be the greatest of classic horror directors. Can't choose a favorite from him. Yeah, I'm there with you on that. And I guess with that being said, I should probably get into actually talking about the featured topic. Otherwise, we'll be here all night. But yeah, let me get through these last few really quick. Metro's favorite is Bride of Frankenstein, easily. The Scene with the Monster and the Blind Man is one of my favorites in all of cinema. Yeah. Bride is just such a towering achievement and such a full force complete work, because they basically said, please do a sequel to Frankenstein. You put us off all these years. You can go do whatever you want. And he's just like, okay, fine. Well, if I'm going to do it, I would do this. And then he did it. Sort of like what Warner's did with Tim Burton on Batman, and saying, please do Batman. Please do a sequel. We don't care what you do. And he goes, okay. And he goes and makes Batman Returns. And they go, what? It's sort of the only parallel I can make with that sort of anything like that, because really there's so little like that. But Bride of Frankenstein is 100% pure James Whale. Invisible Man is right up there for me. I love them both. I love all four of the horror films. I watch them every year, but Invisible Man's right there. But Bride of Frankenstein just has that indescribable magic, because it is purely James Whale. There's no outside anything. And yeah, oh gosh, the scene in the hermit's hut, my goodness. Every single time the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, I have to go, not gonna cry, not gonna cry, not gonna cry, not gonna cry, not gonna cry. Usually get a little misty eyed. Um, and then sometimes you just start bawling just because it's so emotional and intensive and honest and not comedic and not it's a very hard thing to pull off, and Whale insisted on getting the actor OP Heggie to play the part of the hermit and even stop production to wait for him to be available because he knew that that was probably the only person that could carry that part in that scene. And he was absolutely right. I mean, that's one of the most heartbreaking moments I think in the cinematic medium. I mean, every single time it's like, not gonna cry, not gonna cry, man. um but yeah, I mean, they're all great. You can't go wrong with any of them. You really can't. um oh yes, Five Tall Tales, yes, one of my favorite box sets ever. Like ever. Yeah, I mean, that thing is just, I didn't think those would get upgraded from DVD really. And then when they announced that, I'm like, what? And no US label has done that. So it's like, once again, in Europe, American films are better respected. What does that say about our studio labels then? Oh, Wolf got Dragonwing. Excellent. Yeah, it is very macabre. It starts out as a Gene Turney vehicle. And Vincent shows up like, 30 minutes in, and then you're like, oh my God, this is where Vincent Price becomes Vincent Price, isn't it? And you're like, whoa. So it's basically like, imagine Rebecca, but if it was a period film and it was at Fox, and Vincent Price shows up halfway through and takes over, and you're like, okay. And I still think his end scene in that film is one of his best scenes. And I wish the movie had ended there. I think it goes on a little bit too long. Like, if it just had ended right there, those who have seen the film will know exactly what I'm talking about. But I think that would have made it even better. But he's amazing. He makes the film great. It's good enough as it is. Don't get me wrong, but it's a Gene Tierney vehicle, and then Vincent shows up, and you're like, whoa, and everything else just kind of falls to the wayside. Um, oh goodness, Fear and Desire. That is a whole piece in and of itself. Of course, as a diehard fanboy, I'm like, oh, this is great, and look at, if you look at this scene, it represents this. I could do the whole arty thing, but you have to keep in mind this was his first primary feature. It was basically an independent production. He was still learning, which explains why he was so embarrassed for anybody to ever see it, and then practically destroyed copies. So it's a miracle we can even see it. The first time I saw it, it was this atrocious looking copy. Like, half of it was just unwatchable, but I was like, I'm finally seeing Fear and Desire. And then I saw it and I'm like, well, okay, like, I get it, but it's definitely rough in places. But I'd also read a lot of Kubrick books by that point, so I'd seen stills of it, and I kind of knew the gist of the story and the production, and how he thought it was a great idea. He would operate the camera himself, and then he'd be like, I'm not going to worry about sound because we can just do that afterwards and save a bunch of money. And then when they finished, realizing to his horror that that was basically going to be nearly impossible because he had to recreate the entire soundtrack by himself. And then try and get the sync right. So yeah, not the best of ideas, but I do think there are core elements that are already there and present. I think when you get to Killer's Kiss, it's definitely, you can see the improvement already. I think Killer's Kiss is actually very underrated. Most people have never even seen it, let alone Fear and Desire. But Killer's Kiss is a real marked improvement. There's a confidence there already. So I think it's really cool and interesting that you can have the ability to go back and see these, but that you can actually see that growth. And then, not even a whole year later, the Killing just explodes out, and you're like, wow, that's a leap forward. um, oh, awesome. Yeah, Claude Rains says The Invisible Man is pretty incredible. Yes. Oh gosh. Oh, man, there's so many. I think this chair kind of leans. We will begin with the reign of terror. A few murders here and there, murders of small men and murders of large men, just to show that we make no distinction. Just these fingers. Um, wait, no. We might even wreck a train or two. Just these fingers round a signalman's throat. It's just, oh my gosh, it's absolutely magic. And really crazy to think that he was going to be in Bride of Frankenstein. That's who James Whale wanted for Dr. Pretorius, but he just was either unavailable or didn't want to play in a horror film and get typecast. So that's why Ernest Thesiger was tapped. But yeah, originally Claude Rains was supposed to be Dr. Pretorius, just like originally the first choice for the Invisible Man was Colin Clive. And when you think about that and that majestic voice he had, you can picture that. And he almost did it, but he wanted to go back to England. So that's when James Whale hit upon the idea of casting Claude Rains, who he'd remembered from the stage, because he knew he needed somebody with a majestic, very present voice, because that was the role, was the voice. And that's really what established Claude Rains in films. But it's an amazing performance, but it's weird to think about what it would have been like with Colin Clive there. Yes, Dice agrees on the emotion achieved in Bride of Frankenstein. Yes. Oh man, and it's not just there; it's all over the place. But and it goes from horror to danger to suspense to comedy to genuine emotion, and all back and forth and all over the place. It's not just one thing. Um, so, and here is wine to drink. Good. And ironically, he's getting all of man's vices there, smoking, drinking, but also other people have linked it to, obviously, it's basically, communion of sorts with the bread and the wine. And McQueen's commentary even goes as far to say it's sort of like the creature's last supper of sorts. And yeah, as Pete mentions, the atmosphere of the original Frankenstein, you really, it's never, nothing's ever been quite like that. The Bride doesn't really try to do that. And of course, the makeup's even different. A lot of horror fans swear that, the original makeup was more cadaverous, which it is, and more imposing. And Karloff didn't think that the creature speaking was a good idea, and that it lost something from being the pantomime silent performance, which I can understand that argument, but I think the speech was a very important part. And if you ever read the novel, I'm actually rereading right now. If you read Shelley's novel, he gets vociferous after a certain point and has these epic soliloquies that are deeply emotional about his creator's complete rejection of him, which I think is why Bride is a significant improvement in so many ways. But it also manages to get more of the spirit and tenets of the actual book in there too, while it's doing everything else. So that being said, I should probably talk about Jimmy some, because we just cracked an hour and we haven't got started yet. So anyway, again, this is not meant to be comprehensive or anything, but just some general overview. So then you might understand some of the stuff of what I'm talking about in some of these films. But anyway, James Whale was born in England. Believe, if I'm remembering correctly, in the small town of Dudley. But he was one of a number of children, and very quickly realized he was much more of a artistic nature, but that didn't really come to full fruition until he was wounded and captured in World War One. And so he was in a German prisoner of war camp, and they would stage basically do stage plays and stage works to just keep everybody entertained. So I'm sure there was a lot of gallows humor involved, because it's like it's sort of maybe some of the sort of feel we get when we look at things like The Great Escape and the scenes where we're inside the POW camp, and that sort of morbid grimness that everybody can crack these extraordinarily bitter jokes, but apparently in doing all this in the German prisoner of war camp is where he got bitten by the drama bug. And so once the war ended and he came back to England, he did a bunch of odd jobs, but basically got into the theater and just worked his way up and wound up doing most every job. But he was a pretty well-regarded actor and worked with a number of great luminaries who he then worked with later in films in Hollywood. But I think, kind of realized more of his forte was, on the other side of the curtain. So not only was he in props, but he became a set designer. He worked on practically every aspect of theatrical production until eventually he became a director, while still doing the occasional bit of acting. But I think that is a trial by fire experience level that people just don't get anymore. And the reason why I think if anybody could be labeled an auteur, uh, it would be James Whale, because not only did he work in everything, but when he turned to making films, he was working with every single department. So, not many directors literally work on the set design because they themselves were set designers while doing everything else. There are directors who work on set design, but they're not working on that level with every other department, which every interviewee, every bit of information indicates that's what James Whale did. It wasn't just like, oh, this department's going to do this. No, they literally worked with him on every aspect. But so I believe it was 1928 when he was basically got the job to direct a play no one really wanted to do, which was the R.C. Sheriff play Journey's End, which was, a great realistic play about the Great War and about how it basically a small group of soldiers in the trench in the era of trench warfare, and how their basically how their psyches were just completely screwed with. And it really made Colin Clive a star. Colin Clive had the big standout part. I believe it's Captain Stanhope, if I'm remembering the name correctly of the character. But this very heroic but tragic figure with this great weight of guilt. And so the play became a smash. Colin Clive became famous, and so did James Whale. So, like a lot of famous plays around the turn of the decade, with the arrival of talkies, all the studios were looking to Broadway and London stages for talent and plays to produce, because they needed talking things. They needed talking stories, and they needed people who could speak good dialogue. So stage actors who could, actually speak and be heard and be intelligible and give good performances, which was, of course, the ruin of many silent film stars. But they also pulled all of these great talents. So they would pull directors and set designers, but primarily directors and writers who were used to things like, dialogue, for example. So a lot of great directors actually got started by coming over to do the film version of one of their hit plays. And so that's what happened to James Whale. Universal bought the rights to do Journey's End as a film, and so they brought James Whale over to direct the film version. And he had not really had that level of aspirations to get into films, but I think he kind of looked at it as an adventure of sorts, and why not give it a go? And basically got the bug really fast, and brought Colin Clive over to reprise his role. I've only seen Journey's End, the film version, once, because there's no real official film video release. There's a couple versions floating around online, which is how I've seen it, and it's a very, very poor print. It's very dark and washed out. But even if you just see pieces of it, it's amazing to be able to see. I hope it gets an official release at some point, because it's a very important story and very important for James Whale and Colin Clive and Sheriff's play. But that's how he got here. And when you look at that, it doesn't have a lot of the trademark James Whale stuff. It is very much, a filmed play and an early talkie. But even then, I think you can make the argument that you do see some sparks of this is a bit different. It's not just, everybody standing around the table because the microphone's hidden in the flower pot because it's an early talkie and the camera can't move and all that stuff. I think that it does manage to retain some of probably what was on the original stage production, the sort of feeling of impending doom, things like that. I just wish there was a better version, because again, the way I saw it was this crummy YouTube upload, and it just was really horrible. But I was so excited to finally be able to see it. So yeah, that's what brought Whale and Colin Clive as well to Hollywood. And then he became Whale signed, his Universal deal, became a contract director. But this was the original Universal under the Limleys. So you had Carl Limley Sr., head of the studio, and this was the time point where he put his son Limley Jr. in charge, which much to the consternation of some people, because Limley was in his early 20s and he got it as a birthday present, which definitely made some people less than thrilled, which is why we had the sort of rivalry on the Spanish Dracula versus the English language version. But Whale then started making, 2, 3, 4 films a year. And talk about first of those, because again, unfortunately, most of his films are not available on home video, which is just an absolute frustrating shame. But I think the film after Journey's End that really made critics take notice, because it was well received. It was a sizable hit in 1931, which is Waterloo Bridge, which is here on the Forbidden Hollywood Volume 1 set. I don't think this is on any other release. I think this is really the main way to see this, but it's a pretty well, I shouldn't say risque, because it was the pre-code era, but it's a pretty dark story. You basically have, I'm trying to make sure if there's any, there's no extras on here, but it's basically a dark, grim, realistic story that actually united James Whale with the actress Mae Clarke, which is why he tapped her to be in Frankenstein. So already he was doing like what he did on the stage, where when he worked with great talents, he would recognize stuff and, sort of file their names away for later on to be like, I think I know somebody who might be good for this, or if he really clicked with somebody on a film, the next film, if, he thought that might work, it's like, okay, why don't we try and get them in here? But yeah, this was, I think, the film that sort of crystallized in Universal's mind that Whale was, their new go-to guy of sorts. So, some people said he was like the golden boy director of Universal, which kind of in a way. And also Limley Jr. really liked Whale very much personally and appreciated his style and his intelligence. And so kind of at this point, they basically gave him carte blanche and actually let him choose what project he wanted to make from a list of projects. And he looked down the list and he was like, well, the only one I think I would like to do is Frankenstein. And of course, that had already been developed by Robert Florey. And then Robert Florey was just kind of unceremoniously kicked off and was really pissed about it for pretty much the rest of his life. But this was not, intentional or anything. I don't think Will was aware of it, but Florey had kind of done some work on the scripting process. So he did kind of, I think, deserve some credit for figuring out some of the structure of the eventual film version of the story, which was, of course, based on the John Balderston rewrite of the Peggy Webling rewrite play version done by the Hamilton Dean Company. So it's a version, yet again, of the play instead of the original novel. But the film version, which was written on by Garrett Fort and sort of developed by Florey, and of course, once Whale came in, he made his own input known, and it went from there. But Florey kind of deserves some credit for getting some of the groundwork done on, reshaping what the plays had become into the film we know and love. And I think injecting everybody involved managed to inject some more of the Shelley novel into the film version than what was there in the play. So in all ways, I think it does do a good job of getting across the points of the novel, even though it's not Shelley's novel and we don't have the chase across the Arctic and the flashbacks and the building of the mate and all that stuff, which of course they just chopped all that out and saved it for the sequel and then went in a different direction. But of course, Frankenstein is the film that became a smash hit, firmly established horror films as a genre, saying that, Dracula was not just a one-off, that there was something in Limley Jr. insisting that horror films were a good idea because he had to insist and convince his dad that he wasn't crazy. And that's why, Dracula was sort of a test movie. They based it off of the play because they couldn't afford to do a super production of the novel. And it was the Great Depression, which meant their budgets couldn't be high to begin with. And so there were a lot of limitations. It was a risk because it was the first, as David Scull points out, it's the first supernatural talking horror film. Um, and had it not worked, we would not be talking about horror films. So, of course, you have to talk about Frankenstein. And Frankenstein was such a ridiculous hit at the time. It kind of wiped the floor with Dracula in a lot of people's minds. And when you look at it stylistically, it's a already amazing. Like Waterloo Bridge is a giant jump over Journey's End. Of course, not saying much because the only versions of Journey's End look terrible. But Frankenstein over Waterloo Bridge is like, wow, this is already a marked improvement, and it's the same year. But looking at the difference between the Todd Browning Dracula, which I do think is a great film and I adore it, and I hate that people crap all over it because they're like, oh, it's too slow, or there's no music, or it's too much like a silent film. And I'm like, well, yeah, but that's what they're doing. That's the horror and the tension. It's an eerie film. And there is some moving camera work there, and it is doing stuff. It's just not, um, it maybe is a little bit archaic. Maybe it is a little bit like a silent film, but it is a great film. But if you look at that, as much as I love it, and then you look at Frankenstein that came out the same year, it's one of the most cataclysmic jumps in terms of filmmaking technique, of energy, of realism, I mean, this feels like a film from the 40s. It's astonishing. And it took me several times of seeing it because I saw these films out of order. So I saw Bride first, actually, long before I saw the original Frankenstein. But it is an astonishing film for 1931. I mean, my God, it is just an incredible piece of work. Right from the opening, you do have little flourishes of the James Whale humor that come out, but it's much more contained within the film. We aren't having the flights of fancy quite yet, but literally the film opens with the burial sequence, which is very, and obviously inspired some by German expressionism, as all the Universal horrors were, because a lot of the talent making them actually came from Germany, like Karl Freund, among others. But it's already not like anything you've ever seen. It's very dark. We have Henry Frankenstein and Fritz hiding, crouching behind, waiting for the body to be buried. But already we have an element of sound design, which was practically unheard of at this point. There are little tiny things that you don't quite realize they're there, but once you do, I mean, your brain actually does. But it's little things like when they're actually burying the coffin, played up on the soundtrack, you hear all the earth hitting the coffin lid as the guy's shoveling it in on the coffin. It's really loud and it just hits over and over and over. It's very morbid, but I could just always picture James Whale cackling like an idiot in the background, just going like, aha, look what I did. And then shortly thereafter, they wait for everybody to leave. But, we have the added grace note of the gravedigger waiting and then lighting his little pipe and walking off. And it feels very lived in, I think, is the best way to put it. Whereas Dracula, it doesn't have any of that. And Dracula is still a masterpiece and I still love it, but we're already, into the deep end of creativity here. But another little touch, another little flourish just here in the opening when Henry and Fritz start digging up the coffin. If you look very closely, there's a statue of death in the background. One of my favorite bits is Colin Clive digs down and he hurls the earth over his shoulder and it hits death in the face. And so like that had to have been planned because it's basically Frankenstein, saying, all right, death, here, I'm going to win one on you. What's that now? Yeah. And he just literally throws it on the face of death itself, which it's a little flirtatious like that. But again, that's just the opening. We're already in different territory. It is a much darker feeling film, and you read the reports about audiences being freaked out and it not being like anything else they had ever seen. And you can believe it. But I think that in the retelling and the rewriting, they do manage to get most of the key themes of the story across. But we're not having all of the fanciful James Whale humor that we know and love from the later films. This is done much more straight, which The Invisible Man kind of has some of that as well. It's a straight compared to Bride of Frankenstein, for example. It's focused more on the story and it plays it a little bit straighter. There is the whimsical humor, but Invisible Man and Frankenstein, I think, are unique in that they are sort of the straighter films, whereas Old Dark House and Bride of Frankenstein are just going for full tilt whimsy and just they're 100% their own thing. So I can understand why some people might prefer Frankenstein or Invisible Man most, because they have a little bit more narrative drive consistently. Karloff, of course, stole the show, and he was not meant to. he was found by James Whale. Technically, he was found by David Lewis, who was James Whale's partner. And another thing that I think gets brought up a lot when people talk about Whale is the fact that Whale was a gay man and was never in the closet and was always living openly, but he didn't make a giant thing about it as some people would have. And I think that came out of, working in the London theater of the 20s and being around a lot of like-minded individuals. And also, among all other things, Whale was always a gentleman and a highly articulate and intelligent man. And I'm sure he realized what Hollywood was like very quickly getting there in the early talkies, and when things were actually a lot more open and a lot of crazy stuff went on, but you also didn't have to be so completely composed in your outward image. But I think he realized that if he was able to do great work and be himself, but not make a big thing out of it, I think he realized that would make all of that much more palatable and not as objectionable. Would it had it been something more like him working and being openly gay, say in the 1950s? It was a different time. But a lot of people want to read a lot of subtext into his films and stuff, and I think that's fine. But it's all guesswork, it's all speculative because none of us were there. As I said before, if I have the list of people that I wish I could meet and from the past, and it's like getting to meet James Whale and pick his brain for 20 minutes would be like one of the great thrills of my life. Just because the more I learn about him, the more I see these films over and over and over and over again. You get to a point where you start to feel like somebody, and I think he's one of the most fascinating directors ever, and I think he is in there in the pantheon with the greats, unquestionably. But Frankenstein is a landmark achievement, but I think it kind of gets overshadowed by the fact that it's the second founding member of the Universal Horrors, and people just look at it every October, but they don't necessarily look at it as the triumphant film it is. I mean, it's an early talkie. It's astonishing for an early talkie. Like, look at other films of 1931, and there are some great films of 31. There are some great early talkies, but it's unlike anything else from talkies. It's just an astonishing piece of work. It feels like it's from much later in the decade. There is really impressive camera work. There's some really nice moving shots. You get the appearance of some of James Whale's trademark things he liked to do, like the lateral movements where we go through walls that, it shouldn't be technically possible going from one room to another to follow action, but it's a very dynamic movement. And the film was shot by Arthur Edison, who worked with Whale a number of times. One of the great cinematographers of all time, for sure. And Frankenstein has a unique look to it. It's again hugely influenced by German expressionism, but it's got a look of its own. It's darker than most films of that era. There's a lot of deep blacks, but there's also a lot of really nice contrast. It's got a very lived in look to it. In addition to the characterizations, it feels like a world of its own, and it's one of those films where we're never sure of what the time setting is or where the locale is. Is it Britain? Is it Germany? Is it the 1930s? Is it the 1900s? There's a weird anachronism throughout, which historians have pointed to kind of make it like a Never Never Land. Again, to make the Tim Burton reference, it is very much like what happens in the Burton Batman films, where you're unsure of what time period it is. I don't know if that was a conscious thing that they were inspired by Whale and Frankenstein, but it's the other one that springs to mind because this is also talked about in a lot of the documentaries and stuff. But it's definitely there, and it helps separate Frankenstein as its own thing. Um, Again, Karloff is majestic with this absolutely amazing silent performance that's full of deep emotion, moments of terror and horror where you're, just by the sheer power and physical presence of this creature. But it's built up too perfectly. The themes are all there from the novel. And I like what they do with Frankenstein. And to be honest, I think Colin Clive's performance is overlooked because Karloff is so domineering. And really, the film is Colin Clive's because what the character arc that Frankenstein has is really interesting. It's a bit different from the novel. He's a sympathetic character throughout this, and that's not in most Frankenstein adaptations. Hammer, of course, would go the exact opposite way with their masterpieces with Peter Cushing, but I think Clive's performance is the heart of the film, along with Karloff. And I hate the fact that Clive gets overshadowed, and people just they don't always recognize what an amazing performance he gives. He's so anguished and so wrapped up in his work and blind to what he's done until the climax, where he helps lead the charge after his own creation, almost in a sort of self-sacrificial way, from all the guilt that he's carrying. And of course, Clive himself was a very tortured soul in real life, and ostensibly, for lack of a better term, because he was such a terrible alcoholic, essentially drank himself into an early grave, which was, extraordinarily sad. But you can see on screen in his great roles, he just had this overbearing shadow of guilt that always hung over him like a great weight. And I think Whale recognized that, and that's what he was able to pull out in Journey's End, and then Frankenstein, and of course Bride as well. And I think he would have made a good Invisible Man. I can see why Whale pictured that. But I always hate that everybody talks about the amazing Karloff performance, and the iconic isn't even the right word. I mean, the stupefying Jack Pierce makeup, one of, if not the most recognizable makeup of all time. The painstakingly designed makeup that Whale had input in designing. It was basically Whale with some ideas and Jack Pierce with his own ideas and how to make that work. So again, every aspect of Whale's films in this period were full of his own input. Again, if the auteur theory has any any proof in existence, it's got to be James Whale. There is not one aspect of a James Whale production that's right. These were credited as a James Whale production. Lemley Jr. let him do that because they literally were. James Whale had ideas about the makeup, about the set design, about the costumes, about the lighting, about the camera work, about the camera placement, about the camera movement. Of course, he would direct his actors, and literally everything down to the painted backdrops and the cycloramic backdrops used for the for the finale, and all of the mountaintop shots and stuff, again, makes this film feel like it's in its own world. So I think Frankenstein is actually undervalued in a lot of ways, because when you look at it just as a film on its own from 1931, it is astonishing. It feels like a film far newer than its age, and it is ridiculously creative. And it packs all of this into, the short, early talkie runtime, 70 some odd minutes. This, of course, is the old Encore Edition MCA Universal Laserdisc, the restored version. This was the first time they attempted to put back some of the censored scenes that were removed by various state censor boards. And then, of course, the post-code reissue, where they had to recertify pre-code films and then make the adjustments. So Frankenstein got shorn of a number of iconic moments. Dracula lost a few things, and then they were missing for many, many years. So 1987 rolls around. Universal rolls out the Dracula and Frankenstein disc and VHS tape. Dracula, they restored the death screams and things like that. For Frankenstein, most importantly, they restored the most tragic scene, which is the death of Maria at the lake, which was the most notorious scene in the film. Ironically, when the censors cut it, if you see it, it ends with the creature reaching his hands out, which really makes you think far worse. It's like the censoring made it a hell of a lot worse, because it's like, we don't know what happened then. we don't really want to know because that could just have gone really, really bad. So this is where you first get to see on video, and after the pretty much from 1938 until 1987, you could never see the full scene where the Maria tragically drowns in the lake, and the creature is horrified by the event. And of course, the footage is much degraded, which is why to this day on the current restoration on Blu-ray, when you get to that scene, the footage gets really degraded, even with the cleanup that's been applied. That's because it was just missing for all those decades, and it's a miracle we still have it. They also restored little things like Dr. Waldman injecting the hypodermic into the creature's back that was removed by a lot of censors back in the 1930s. So this version is actually 99% complete. There are, one or two little frame damage jumps and things like that. Transferring here is actually really, really nice. I was very impressed looking at this again. Unfortunately, it's analog audio only, but the mono in here is pretty good. Not too hissy or anything. Sounds great. The one problem is that it's missing, for me, probably the best line of the whole film. So, which of course is Colin Clive's line right after "It's Alive," which was cut by every censor board when he has the line about knowing what it's like to be God. And of course, I have to do it now. So of course, everybody knows it's alive. It's alive. And of course, he's manic at this point. He's like, it's alive, because he's been working for weeks and he's about to pass out. Everybody quotes that, but they don't quote all the stuff around it. There's the really great bit before where Waldman and Elizabeth and Victor come in, and they're the spectators, and he has the great like, oh, of all the times for anybody to come, why can't they leave me alone? But then he's got him up there, and he's just like, you all think I'm crazy. Quite a good scene, isn't it? One man crazy, three very sane spectators. So there again is the notion of it being like a theatrical stage setting. But the best line of the film comes after "It's Alive." It's the one nobody quotes, and it was missing for ages because it was considered blasphemous, of course. And it was found on the original sound disc that some collectors found, and so that wasn't restored until the 2000 DVD Universal did. And that, of course, is, oh, in the name of God, now I know what it feels like to be God. Oh, and then, of course, he passes out. In this version and all the others, there's usually a jump cut, or they put the big clap of thunder over it, and he's clearly, speaking. So it's a shame when that's not there, because I love the way he delivers it, and he just passes out because he's completely manic at that point. And again, Clive's performance is so overlooked, because it was his film. It's Frankenstein's film. It's called Frankenstein, and then Karloff comes in, and everybody forgets about everything else. And everybody else is great in it. Mae Clark is really good as Elizabeth. She has some nice, spirit in the role, and what could be, very dull and willowy or whatever. Even John Bolts is great as Victor, even though it's a throwaway part. And then you have, of course, the immortal Edward von Sloan come back and play Dr. Waldman, basically a version of obviously Van Helsing from Dracula, but he plays it differently. Everybody says, oh, he's just playing Van Helsing again. I'm like, no, he does. It's not just because he's not wearing glasses. He is a bit different. And of course, his fate is totally different. But Edward von Sloan is just one of those faces that screams Universal horror. And of course, saying that, there's Dwight Fry. Dwight Fry is in this film playing the character of Fritz. James Whale apparently became a giant fan of Dwight Fry and great friends, and kept casting him in all his pictures because he always wanted to try and help him get work, because Dwight Fry had gotten typecast after Dracula playing Renfield, and despite having a long, amazing career on Broadway, couldn't get decent work in Hollywood after Dracula. It was just small, crazy parts, and he actually had a very sad death. He was working in a airplane factory in World War II and died while he was riding the bus. He would do tiny bits of acting work all day and then work in the airplane factory all night. Never got the credit he deserved, but you'll see him pop up in other James Whale films. He's, of course, in both Invisible Man and Bride of Frankenstein. But I always thought that was really an impressive thing for Whale to do, because they didn't have to do stuff like that, but apparently they got on very well. And Fry has a field day as Fritz in this film. He's you know, superstitious, spooky, very domineering, but yet also very endearing and very, and of course, commits the grave error of grabbing the wrong brain, grabbing the criminal brain because he gets spooked by the skeleton in the medical classroom. And of course, the age old question: how in the hell does Henry Frankenstein not recognize that he's putting a criminal brain, an abnormal brain, into his creation? Does he not care? Does he not read the jar? Did he not pay attention during Brain Class 101? We don't know. But of course, when it's brought up later, he's like, abnormal brain? No, well, it couldn't possibly make any difference, could it? And probably my favorite moment in the film, I can't do it because I'll butcher it. I can't remember the exact words, but the monologue he has as Frankenstein, about pondering the mysteries of the unknown. It's like, but if you think like that, people call you crazy. Well, if I could discover one of those things like that, like the secret of eternity, for example, I wouldn't care if they did call me crazy. And some have said that it may have been, that whole speech may have been written by Whale and Clive because it's not in the screenplay. That is a beautiful moment of philosophy there. That discussion that Henry has with Dr. Waldman. So this film is full of little things like that. And it still manages to reprise moments from the novel, even though it's based on a rewrite of a rewrite of a rewrite of the stage play rewrite of the novel and not the novel itself. So I think Frankenstein is a landmark achievement. I just think it's not as critically beloved as it could be and should be. I really do. So yeah, this is the encore version. Got too much stuff here. So the best version to have now is, of course, the current restoration on Blu-ray, which is here in the Universal Legacy Collection, which bunches together all of the entire Frankenstein cycle, plus Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. And you can get this in the complete Universal box, where it includes all of these. But the restoration they did on these titles is amazing. Of course, you get all the old DVD extras, and Rudy Belmer does the commentary on Frankenstein. It's a phenomenal track if you haven't listened to it yet. And of course, you get the iconic classic David J. Skull produced documentaries he did for all of the classic Universal horrors, which you have to watch them every year. It's like a tradition. So this is the version to watch now, but I think it's cool sometimes to go back to the older releases and look at how things were. And with the Universal horrors, because they were reprinted and reissued so many times, every time they come out on video, they're a little bit different. So the Blu-rays are great. They're not 100% perfect. I think in some places, they may have cleaned up the audio a little bit too much here and there on certain titles there, but very, very little is 100% perfect. But for what you get on disc, it's the best they've ever looked. And you put these on and sometimes your mouth just falls open because it's like, I never thought these would look that good. You get more of the silver coming back in the image, more of the grayscale than we've ever gotten before. And again, Arthur Edison's photography on this film is just amazing. So that's Frankenstein. So next, Frankenstein was such a success, they immediately wanted a sequel. And James Whale was like, no, I don't do sequels. That's just, it's credited as saying, the idea of a sequel was like abhorrent to Whale. It's like, I did the movie. There's no more. Like, they made him shoot an ending, additional tag ending, because originally the film ends with the burning windmill and both creature and creator die. That was the idea. That was the whole character arc. But then after test screenings, they added the final tag with the Baron coming back, and Henry's still alive, and there's Elizabeth. And if you look really closely, it's doubles, because neither actor was available. Colin Clive was already sailing back to England, I think. But honestly, I am glad that they did that, not just so we could get a sequel, but I think it befits the tone more. And Henry does go through a lot of stuff, and you really don't want to see him die. And it's just whimsical enough, but it's also whimsical. And that's another thing. I think that may be the first time we start to see some of the pure whale whimsy start to come out, because of course it's the Baron, who was a character right in the James Whale whimsical wheelhouse, as this British stuffed search sort of, oh, don't know what my son is up to, oh, he's a damn stupid boy is what he is, oh. But so after that, Whale had to convince Universal that he could do something else besides a Frankenstein sequel. And this actually kicked off a number of years of him trying to duck doing Return of Frankenstein because he didn't want to do it. So Universal had acquired a property called Benighted, which was a novel by J.B. Priestley about a bunch of travelers who wind up at this creepy old house somewhere in the wilds of England and in the middle of a terrible storm, and all of these terrors that befall them trying to simply survive the night in this house full of crazy people and murderers. So James Whale comes across this, and in the adaptation and the production and everything, it becomes the absolute triumph. Wow, that ruined the dramatic moment. I'm sorry. Trying to be a little Daisuke like here, I have to admit. I love the way that Daisuke does this whole speech and then puts the title up. The Old Dark House from 1932. This is where the James Whale style just explodes out. This film is supposed to be a horror film. The novel itself, I haven't read the whole thing. I have read some sections of it. I really do want to read the original Priestley novel, but it's a straight out horror tale. The ending's a dark ending. Everybody's in real mortal peril the whole time. Well, this is a black comedy. But it has moments of suspense, and it has all of the stuff that's in Frankenstein that I talked about, all that great intelligence and creativity. Well, here it just explodes even further. This film has incredible sound design from just the thunderclaps and the howling rain and winds and everything. But it's the same basic idea. Various travelers in the middle of nowhere in England during a terrible storm with landslides and stuff. If I have to take refuge at this creepy old house filled with eccentrics and murderers. And it's an indescribable film if you've never seen it before. It's a comedy. It's a black comedy. It's a horror film. It's all of those. And it manages to be its own identity, and there's nothing else in the world like it. There really isn't. And I wanted to see this film for many, many years. The availability was never that great. There is the Laserdisc version. Then there was the Kino DVD, which is how I finally got to see it. The quality was not very good, but I was so mesmerized seeing this for the first time, and I was like, it was one of those few moments where you see something and you're like, where has this been all my life? I feel like this is a part of me somehow. Again, like I said with Bride, I think this film, Invisible Man and Bride of Frankenstein, it's literally like you've just spent the evening with James Whale. You really have. There's so many quotable lines. All of the dark characters who live in the house in the novel have become complete eccentrics, led primarily by Ernest Thesiger as Horace Femme, who just walks out and he basically looks like, Dr. Pretorius a couple years younger had a really rough night. And as soon as he appears, you know what the tone of this film is going to be. Karloff is led to be they marketed it as being the Karloff follower to Frankenstein. And he, of course, plays Morgan, the butler, who, of course, was the inspiration for Lurch and the Addams Family. Of course, Old Dark House influenced many, many things, but that being one of the key influencees. But people see this expecting it to be a Karloff film, and then they come away disappointed because Karloff is just the butler. And after the opening, he doesn't really appear except for a few other moments. And they're also thinking it's going to be a horror film, and they're disappointed because it's a whimsical, morbid black comedy of the macabre. I think this is probably the ultimate of macabre films. It's also one of the most whimsical films you'll ever see in your life. It is indescribable. It doesn't fit into any genre. It's a magical, gem of the 1930s. It is one of those handful of films you see it once, you have to then rewatch it every year. Um, every character in this film, because it's a small cast of characters, is cast to perfection. A Whale chose from great stage performers that he knew, and just and then of course the main cast were all primary outside of Karloff. The primary players were actually pretty new to films. This was the first, if I'm remembering correctly, Gloria Stewart had recently started at Universal, so she was early to films. Lillian Bond was early to films. This was technically Charles Laughton's first American film. He was brought over for other things, and due to delays and such, he actually wound up doing Old Dark House first, and then Old Dark House had to be held up until the Paramount House could come out first, and of course, then Lawton appeared in Island of Lost Souls as well. So in the same year, Lawton did this film and Island of Lost Souls, in one of the complete great actor moments of an actor doing a complete 180 in the same year. Like I like to talk about Jimmy Stewart doing Harvey in Winchester 73, both in 1950. Look at Charles Laughton in The Old Dark House and look at Charles Laughton in Island of Lost Souls. And it's like the definition of what an actor is. It's like, how does somebody do two completely different performances like that? So yeah, and then Raymond Massey is new to films, and Melvin Douglas as well. It's a phenomenal cast, and again, so ridiculously quotable. Um, I mean, "Have a potato" is just etched into your brain and heart forever. I just blurred out moments from this film. I can't help it. It's like just laughter and sin, laughter and sin. No beds. They can't have beds. My sister is a little deaf. She was at the point of arranging these flowers, and he just throws them on the fireplace. It's like, that's just so bizarre. You can't help but laugh. Um, there's even an actual great romance woven in the film, even though it's very compressed because it's a 75-minute runtime. But this was a lost gem for a long time, and had it not been for Curtis Harrington, who was a friend and sort of disciple of Wales, trying his darndest to get a copy preserved in the late 60s. Had it not been for his efforts, we would not have this film at all, because again, it was suppressed because of the 1963 remake. And of course, it was not successful in the original release because it was a strange blend of horror and black comedy, very very British comedy, I think it's easy to say. So audiences didn't really take to it. It wasn't a sizable hit or anything, and it just kind of got swept aside. And then got reissued once with some cuts after the production codes. It got reissued, I think, in 1938, I think it was, or 39, something like that. And then after that, that was it. And it just sat on a shelf rotting. And then when Cohen did the 4K restoration a number of years ago, it played in a couple theaters around October or December-ish. And then they came out with this Blu-ray, which is, you can still get it, still in print. The other release is available in the UK, which is the Masters of Cinema version. Uses the same transfer. They add a nice extra or two, and do have the original poster art. So I really do want to get it, even though it is pretty much double dipping. But this is just one of the best Blu-rays ever released. This is one of my favorite discs. The restoration on here, given what we had to live with before, is just astonishing. Again, I think this actually looks better than all of the Universal restorations combined. It's just, it makes the film shine. Arthur Edison's photography comes across so beautifully in this 4K restoration. It's just, I mean, it's a sight to behold. And here on the inner, they recreate the iconic moment. You take the inserts out, of Karloff as Morgan confronting Gloria Stewart. I would like to get the Laserdisc because they use the famous moment where she's at the open door and Karloff's hand has come across the top to close the door and scare the bejesus out of her. But this film is just ridiculously creative. I don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it. There's really nothing else quite like it. I think it predates films that are the sort of I mean, the only film that comes to mind that's anything like this is 1995's Clue, which I am obsessed with. And when I saw this, it was like, oh my god, that's where this comes from. This level of dark, morbid comedy and death and horror and suspense and I talk about this as a comedy, but it does have moments of horror. It does have moments of suspense. It does have some of the James Whale-isms in the terms of right down to it reprises what he does with his introductions when he introduces the monstrous figure Frankenstein. You have the three quick cuts that Whale likes to use to give you a closer but shocking first look at the creature. Well, Karloff gets that here in the old dark house. He gets the multiple cut close up that gets progressively closer. And then Whale reprises that again when the Invisible Man first appears in the inn at the opening. When he comes through the door, you have those successive closer close-ups. It's a very particular stylistic way of introducing a character that is exclusive and a total James Whale-ism. So you do have things like that. I will say this film was heavily influenced by the silent classic The Cat and the Canary, which is really the primordial, haunted house film where everybody's gathered around in the dark old mansion and there's secret passages and the arms that come out and grab people and things like that. Whale was a huge fan of that film once he saw it. And so I know that was a big influence on this. But that's more of an atmospheric thing. This is unmistakably James Whale. It's just unlike anything else. And for those who have not seen it, I cannot recommend this highly enough. It is one of the treasures of the 1930s. Yeah. I forgot. I had this set aside. And that brings us to The Invisible Man, just sticking to the big horror films for now. So, after The Old Dark House not being hugely successful, it wasn't a bomb or anything. It just wasn't, it didn't do Frankenstein numbers, obviously. And everybody, just kind of was like, oh, that was a weird one, and then forgot about it. Again, they wanted to do the Frankenstein sequel. And again, Whale was like, oh, dear God, no, please. I don't want to do it. So he was working on other things. He did other films, obviously, as a contract director, but they did want him to do another horror property because, again, it was still the Great Depression and Universal needed money because, it's simple economics. So they had the rights to Invisible Man for some time, and it had been in development hell. It had many writers, like 12 different script drafts, and everybody had just pretty much ignored the H.G. Wells novel and also used elements of the book called Murderer Invisible by Philip Wiley, which is it's a whole different thing. But there's a bunch of crazy stuff, and if you read into all the different proposals, it is just mad, the stuff they came up with. But then somebody remembered, oh yeah, H.G. Wells is supposed to have script approval. Oh crap, what do we do? I don't know. And so Whale had come up with a treatment idea that had some good ideas, but then I think the genius masterstroke was in deciding to call in R.C. Sheriff, the writer of Journey's End and a friend of Whale's, to work on the screenplay with Whale and have Whale do The Invisible Man. And Sheriff was the one who rightly recognized, why has everybody thrown out this amazingly good novel? I mean, this is H.G. Wells after all. If you're going to be adapting it, why not use the book itself? And I think what he realized was there was a strength there, but you also had to make certain changes to strengthen it as a feature film, 75-minute runtime at this time period. And so he had to condense certain things. He had to solidify certain character arcs. He adds in the romance of the film, but doesn't make it too obvious and doesn't make it too strained because he knows he has a certain amount of playtime. And personally, I think it's one of the most brilliant adaptations of a novel ever done. I love H.G. Wells. I love reading the novel. He is the father of modern science fiction. There's no doubt about it. He's one of the great geniuses of all literature and many other fields. And he was a great early adopter of the artistry of motion pictures as well. He was a great champion of films when most people totally, crapped on films. Um, and he had hated Island of Lost Souls because he felt Paramount had totally taken Island of Dr. Moreau, his novel, and just thrown out all his philosophy and made a straight horror film, which is what they did, obviously. But ironically, they managed to get more of the spirit of the novel, I think, in that film than any other version that's come out since. So, Island of Lost Souls, I think, is still the best version of Island of Dr. Moreau. It just doesn't have all of Wells's philosophy as overt as his book. But what Sheriff does with Invisible Man, I think, is one of the few films that is such a drastic improvement on the original source material that it is actually better. I think it's one of the 5 or 10 best book to film adaptations ever done. I think this film is a masterpiece, and I think the writing and the story and the plotting is criminally undervalued. And that all goes to the genius of R.C. Sheriff and what he did with this story. So the Invisible Man actually is a tragedy. You sort of have a Jekyll and Hyde type vibe because it is a scientist blinded by his own ambition, but really there is a lot of the spine of the Frankenstein film story, if you want to really look into it. Much in the way that you can argue the Mummy 1932 is basically a remake of the 1931 Dracula's structure. There is that interesting mirroring there. But Invisible Man has a flavor all of its own, and James Whale filled it with a cast of British eccentrics and totally colored every element to his own personal style and brings that whimsy from the old dark house, but sort of combines it with that straight narrative of Frankenstein. So it's a amalgamation of the two, all brewed into the 1933 Invisible Man. So I think it's that perfect distillation of the two sides of James Whale. And then I think this would get magnified and expounded upon for Bride of Frankenstein. And with each of these films, every film, he's getting better and better and better and better and better. And, the film stock is getting better and the crews are getting better. And of course, Invisible Man is really one of the great special effects films. The John Fulton effects work in this is still mind boggling. And the fact that he managed to pull this off in 1933 with, a guy in a skin tight black velvet suit and having to shoot multiple exposures, 20, 30, 40, 50 takes at a time, and then having to hand paint frames. I think they supposedly did like some 60,000 odd frames had to be hand retouched to eliminate any possible visible elements. I mean, it's an astonishing work just from a visual standpoint. Arthur Edison returns, and it is a staggeringly gorgeous looking film. I think and again, sort of combines elements of both Frankenstein and Old Dark House, because again, this was sort of a team at work and they were just getting better and better. Story wise, this film is dominated obviously by the titular character, performed one for the ages by Claude Rains, who was a James Whale choice, much to the consternation of everyone who just knew him from a terrible screen test. And Whale knew him from the stage and knew his voice was so impressive, and he knew he needed someone with a voice because that's all there was for the majority of the film. You don't see Claude Rains until the end. But that being said, the performance itself is just, everybody talks about Karloff and Frankenstein, but I mean, Rains in The Invisible Man is equally as iconic, and he has to portray humanity and madness at the drop of a hat because, of course, in the Sheriff version, the drugs have affected his brain with the dastardly monocaine, making him more and more and more gradually insane and psychopathic and playing up on all of the darker sides of humanity. So again, the sort of Jekyll and Hyde scenario is kind of in there, and I think it does it better than every version of Jekyll and Hyde, if I'm honest. I think this is one of the rare perfect films. I don't see how anybody could ever do this story any better than what Sheriff and Whale achieved. I think this is a remarkable achievement because it's a horror film that will make you literally laugh your rear end off and also make you tense up with suspense and feel the absolute tragedy of the Jack Griffin character, because his arc is such that, he was just doing a great thing in the name of science and trying to further his own name and actually achieve something, which is what all anyone wants to do in life. But he just didn't happen to have the knowledge about the other experiment with monocaine potentially inducing madness. And that one little factoid causes everything to go wrong. Another thing to keep in mind, the Invisible Man is actually the most dangerous of all the classic horror characters, simply from body count alone. He manages to kill more people and do more damage with just these fingers than everyone else combined. There's no telling how many people died in the train crash. For a moment on the cover pictured here, when Flora appears to him, and it's the one scene they have together. It is a remarkable scene because Griffin goes in and out of his megalomania, and he softens when he sees her. And, he's like, "Oh, you're wearing that funny little hat. I always love that." And they have this great little romantic scene, but then he has the flashes of the monomania come back until finally, he starts gripping her hands tightly, and you can't see his face at all, but you just feel what his face is doing, even though you can't see anything. And this is your head doing this. And then he has that great monologue about, power to walk into the gold vaults of nations, into the secrets of kings. And then finally he builds to the point where he actually stands up, and then he's like, "Even the moon's frightened of me, frightened of the touch of my little invisible finger." It's just absolutely remarkable. And again, I think this is a testament to the performance, to the photography, to Sheriff's writing, and to Whale's direction. And I think everything just came together on this film and points the way towards Bride of Frankenstein, absolutely, without question. It is the in-between film of Frankenstein and Old Dark House and Bride of Frankenstein, but in its own right is one of the masterpieces of cinema, without question. And I don't know what it is. I think maybe it's just because the film is so strong, but it's one of those that every time I watch it, I find a new depth. I associate with it more. The first time I saw it, I was blown away. The second, fourth, fifth, 10th time I saw it, I absolutely adored it and quote it and everything. But now when I watch it every year, it's something peculiar, but there's certain films that always grow with you. And I now feel Invisible Man, in addition to having the James Whale stamp all over it and having the whimsical humor and having the strong narrative and the amazing lead performance and the amazing additions on the novel, it's developed this eloquence for me. And every time I get to the ending, it has this resonance and this eloquence again that um it really gets to me every time. And it's a very simple thing, but it's so eloquent, and it's such a lost art in films of today, for sure, that I don't know why I kind of get choked up every time. Every time I get to the end of The Invisible Man, it's not like when people or kids see King Kong and they get sad and they cry at the end when Kong dies. Why does Kong have to die? It's not that sort of thing. It's because it's so darn eloquent. I think it's one of the great endings to any film. Of course, it's iconic and this isn't giving anything away because these films are so old. But yeah, if anyone has not seen these, please go and see these. But you already know how this film's going to end. The finale of the death scene, where the invisibility goes with the passing of the Invisible Man, and that's the only time you actually see Claude Rains. And again, an absolutely staggering John Fulton effects shot. I mean, it still gives you chills to this day. It still works. There's not a bad moment in any of the effects of this film. But that's still one of the great iconic effects shots when Claude Rains fades slowly into visibility. But when that happens, and it's the part of that amazing score, because this is still an early talkie, so there's only score at the beginning and the last 5 or so minutes of the film. Something about it just gets to me now. Now that I've seen it so many times, it's so damn eloquent. So I think The Invisible Man is if it weren't for Bride of Frankenstein, I would say it's the greatest of all Universal horror films. Um, it's still one of the best horror films ever made. I think it's the second best Universal horror film, just behind only Bride of Frankenstein. I could understand the argument that people might prefer it because it does have that straighter narrative. It's not quite as completely off the charts whimsical as Bride is. But again, Bride is really its own thing. It's its own genre in and of itself. Invisible Man is hinting towards that. It's building towards that. Even though Will and everybody else had no idea of this at the time, this is just how it happened. So again, Invisible Man for me is the number two of Universal horrors, period. Actually, all horror films, I would go ahead and say, because that's just how my own personal feelings go. But I don't think it doesn't get talked about in the same way as the more famous ones. Like Universal puts out the box sets and they put out the imagery of Lugosi as Dracula, of the Jack Pierce Frankenstein makeup. People know Dracula and Frankenstein and Creature from the Black Lagoon name and by visual, but they by now in 2020 they haven't necessarily seen the films, or if they have, they've seen Dracula and Frankenstein and they're like, oh, they're old, and that's about it. But I wish more people would see The Invisible Man. I think they would be genuinely shocked. It is a film unlike any other, and it is setting the stage for Bride of Frankenstein. It's perfectly cast. Some of the great characters of 1930s cinema are here. Some of the great characters of Universal horror and James Whale films, of course, especially E. Clive and the inimitable Una O'Connor, who some people can't stand. I can't get enough of her screaming. She has probably the greatest shrieking scream in the history of motion pictures that will rupture eardrums. So, of course, those of you who know what I'm talking about, and she doesn't do that in other films. Apparently, James Whale loved her acting so much that he would encourage her to just go over the top, and she does. It's like attending an opera of shrieks and Bride of Frankenstein, and I can't get enough of her whimsical, over the top characterization. So just another fun part of returning to these films every year, and another thing that Whale insisted on, because you see her in so many other classic films. She doesn't do any of that stuff. I couldn't even begin to try and do an impression of that. That is one of those things. It's just impossible to do. But it's like, how can one person possibly scream that much that loud? It's like, I don't know. So this is the old, again, Encore edition release. What's cool about this is one of the few Universal horrors that was done in the transition where they started adding digital soundtracks. So this does have a PCM mono track. However, as you can tell, this is in the Critics' Choice line. So you get this LD jacket that's otherwise an Encore jacket, but with the lovely strip of Gene Shalit making these weird faces over the cover, which, I like Gene Shalit. You like Gene Shalit, but did we really need, that's so goofy. It always cracks me up, but at least they were getting these titles out there. So as you can see, otherwise, this is exactly like an Encore disc. But again, the important part is that it does add a digital soundtrack. I did rewatch this particular copy this year. The transfer on here is actually quite nice. It looks very good. And what's cool about these for the horror films, they did try and add special features. There's no chapter stops except for the very end of side 2 has one chapter, which is the very end of all these. They have a small section of stills, and apparently most of them came from the archives of Forrest Ackerman, the publisher of Famous Monsters of Filmland. So that's a really cool touch, and a very vintage piece that makes you feel of, okay, this is definitely of that time period. Not anywhere near like a Criterion level special features section, but at least it was nice to see them trying somewhat. And this is one of the few that has digital sound, because of course most were early Encore edition discs with just analog only sound. And of course they were using the vaulted print elements. So this is an old print transfer. It's obviously not perfect. And the version that you watch nowadays is, of course, the Blu-ray. This had a complete overhaul restoration, and of course, was much more complicated because of all the effect shots. And on the DVD, there were some visible wires because it was a little brighter than some of the older releases. I think they did do a little bit of wire removal, not all of them, but there is a little bit, which is pretty much what happens in most modern restorations. They just did that on the Criterion World War of the Worlds. That's the Paramount restoration where they did remove some of the wires on the Martian ships. So it is kind of common because you wouldn't have seen those on the original prints because of generational loss, and a lot of times video stuff is not mastered in the exact same way as it would have on a print. So when stuff is visible, it wasn't supposed. It ironically was not so. It was supposed to have been invisible, but of course they weren't thinking about video and DVD back in 1933. But this had a complete overhaul restoration. It looks absolutely astonishing. The audio has been cleaned up. And of course, this ports over all the lovely old extras. The commentary track on here is great by Rudy Belmer. By the way, I should have mentioned, I totally forgot. The extras on the Old Dark House poured over all the old ones. There's a lovely bit with Curtis Harrington. The old commentaries are great. The one by Gloria Stewart giving her memories, which is a really cool track. And then Whale's biographer, James Curtis, does an amazing track. And I wish I had a copy of his book. It's literally called Gods and Monsters. I've read it many times. I just haven't bought a copy, and I'm going to correct that. Actually, doing this stream made me remember, oh God, I never bought that. I need a copy of that because I want to reread it already again. That is the book on Whale, the James Curtis biography, if you haven't read it. And of course, there was the Bill Condon film, Gods and Monsters, that's a sort of fictionalized account of Whale's later years, but it's still a good film with its heart in the right place, with a great Ian McKellen performance. But yeah, this also, of course, has the David Skull documentary ported over from the DVD, which is a classic to watch. This is the Legacy Collection that bundles in the Invisible Man sequels. And of course, they have nothing to do with the original film. They were made in the 40s under the new Universal regime as B pictures. But they do sort of have a loose continuity, which is appreciated. Of course, stuff happens like monocanes for some reason becomes duocane. Why, we don't know. Maybe just screenwriters not paying attention. But for my money, every time I go back to these, after a certain point, all the artistry of the pre-code era and the golden age of horror of the 30s is gone. James Whale is long gone. A lot of the great names are gone. So after you do the Wolfman 1941 and you get into the B films, the Mummy sequels, and then eventually the Monster Mashers, the House films, and then they were killed off by the Abbott and Costello films. Once you get to those, your mileage is going to vary, and it never has the same artistry. After the Wolfman, Frankenstein meets the Wolfman is an outlier. I love the Mummy's Hand, but then after that, the Mummy sequels are just total B films for kids. But they do have their moments, and I rewatch all of them every year just because I have to. But for my money, I actually think the Invisible Man series, even though it's not exactly a series because they don't have anything to do with the first film outside of some name drops, I think this is actually the strongest overall. If you look at all of the films, Invisible Man's Revenge is a little weak on the story, but it's still solid enough. All of them have the amazing John Fulton effects that only get better over time. Invisible Man Returns is one of the best Universal 40 sequels. It's a lot of fun, and Vincent Price is the Invisible Man, so that alone should be your selling point. And it's as amazing as it sounds if you have not seen it. And again, the effects work is even better. Then Invisible Woman is a phenomenal screwball comedy. It's an outlier. It's not a horror film at all. It is terribly underrated. If it was not included in these sets, people might actually look at it as the great screwball comedy that it is. Has a great late period John Barrymore performance even. That is a wonderful, great film that nobody talks about. But it's sold as an Invisible Man sequel, and it's not. It has nothing to do whatsoever. Invisible Agent is the war period picture that they did where they have a guy go in behind enemy lines, but he makes himself invisible because he's the grandson of the Invisible Man. So you can see where they were kind of going with this. Has none of the artistry that James Whale, put in there. But, if you were looking at all of these as individual series, I actually think the Invisible Man series is the strongest overall. I think all of the films are good. I think, the original masterpieces are of course great, but all the later films are still solid and good, unlike what happened to Dracula and Frankenstein and the Wolfman, so on and so forth. And again, I love all of them, but if you're just looking on a quality point, I think this is probably the strongest overall, looking at all of them combined. And then, of course, we come to the crown jewel of Universal horror. I'll just go ahead and say it. Probably the crown jewel of the entire Universal library in a lot of ways. It's hard to think of a film that's as iconically linked with the studio and is such an artistic triumph in so many different ways. I mean, the closest you get to this are the Universal held Hitchcock titles, Touch of Evil. There's a number of others, but Universal is so closely linked with the classic horror films, and this is the crown jewel of all of them. It's one of the artistic triumphs of the medium. It's it's one of the best films of the 1930s, one of the best films ever made, and of course, I'm talking about Bride of Frankenstein. Now, of course, I do have all the various sets, but the only standalone copy I have of Bride is actually my old Universal Classic Monster Collection VHS tape, which I still have. I bought a number of these when I find them. I think it would be cool to have all of these just because I grew up with them. I would see these in video stores, and I have such nostalgia for them. So I only had like two of these, and then I now have like four or five. So I just anytime I see one and it's not some ridiculous price, I go ahead and get it because I still have such nostalgia for these. But Bride is indescribable. Bride is everything I've talked about so far, but built up and magnified. And again, they wanted Whale to do a sequel to Frankenstein so badly, and it was already 4 years later, and he's finally like, "All right, okay, fine, but if I'm gonna do it, here's what I would do." And they said, "Sure, please, we need money. We don't care what you do. Just make a Frankenstein sequel." Um, so this is the film where Whale had full input in the script, and there were several script drafts and other writers, but essentially what happened was after all that stuff and what they brought to Whale, and Whale was like, "Oh, this is dreadful." He basically, was like, "Okay, we need to start fresh." One or two ideas from all those treatments kind of leaked their way in, but basically Whale sat down and built out the new story, and with the new screenwriter William Hurlbut, and basically the two of them cooked up the basic ideas, and Whale was the one who came up with the idea and insisted on having the prologue with Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley and Lord Byron, which is totally not like what you would get in a film of 1935. That's right off the bat, giving you a completely out there touch by having the historical background of the real life gestation of Frankenstein, but of course, stylized and done in a way that, you know, doesn't have the extra content that was originally there. Because originally, apparently, it ran on for a little bit, and the censors had a lot of stuff cut out, about 2 minutes of the prologue, because it made reference to the sort of debauchery elements of the real life events. Because Byron and Polidori and the Shelleys were in the house, and they had the contest to create a ghost story and such. But the reasons why they were there is, Percy Shelley had left his wife and two kids to run off with Mary, and then Byron was a notorious womanizer and devil may care type fellow, and they were notorious for their, public lives and the gossip that trailed them. So there were allusions to that originally in the prologue, apparently, and those got trimmed out. There are some trims in Bride. Originally, it premiered at I think 90 minutes, so there were about 15 minutes of cuts to get it down to the 75-minute runtime. Nothing major, but some of the subplots were kind of trimmed around. And if you read into the history of the film, that this is one of the films where I would absolutely love to see any of the lost stuff, because it would just be amazing. I think in some ways, some things got strengthened because of that. But in others, it's just, Ted Kent, who was an amazing editor who edited for Whale a number of times, and edited Bride of Frankenstein found really great ways to move around that. But if you look really closely in certain scenes, you can see the seams. Like when Pretorius first appears, when he goes into the room, first he says, Baron, isn't it now? Because of course, originally the old Baron died when hearing his after the stress and shock of hearing his son was dead. That was another continuity gap from the first film because it's a sequel, but they didn't really go 100% on we have to keep perfect continuity. So there's a few things. It starts with Henry being brought into the castle and everybody thinks he's dead when we got the tag ending at the end of the original Frankenstein. Little things like that. But so there's that when Pretorius first comes in. And if you look closely as Ernest Thesiger's walking in, he's already mouthing dialogue, but it's been dropped. So there's fun little things like that you can spot. The really cool one I didn't see for the longest time in the amazing iconic scene where Henry sees the fruits of Pretorius's efforts and he puts on his little cap and it's like his box of black magic and he pulls out all the jars of all of his little creations. Well, if you look very closely, you see we only see certain ones because there's an extra jar that was removed out of fear of possibly upsetting some sensors. But so we don't see the final one, which was actually one of a child in a high chair. And, Pretorius had some witty one-liner about, I wonder what he will grow up into. But if you look at the reverse shot, the shot where all the jars are lined up, Pretorius comes around to Henry, and Henry's like, but this isn't science. It's more like black magic. If you look very closely at the reverse shot, you see there, it's like right there in the center, you can actually see the jar with the John Fulton effect of the Pretorius's baby creation. So it's still there. So it's amazing to think that, you can actually catch a glimpse of something that was cut out, but that's one of those really cool little blink and you miss it bits where Ted Kent had to cut around something, but you can still like see the trails of it. But there you can actually like see the backside of it. So that's a really cool thing I didn't see for the longest time. But there's a lot of little things like that in Bride that I think you can spot simply because that pre-release trimming. And of course, they did rework the ending, which originally ended with Henry and everybody, dying in the explosion and stuff. And it was basically, I think, Whale basically saying, "Aha, now I'm done, and there can't possibly be any more sequels. They're all dead. I killed them all. We're good." But of course, test audiences didn't like it, and just like on Frankenstein, I think it was the wrong note to end on. I think the little tag they have is perfect, and practically the final line of the film, the creature's self-sacrifice is the entire payoff for the creature learning to speak, and I think proves Karloff was wrong in thinking the creature should remain mute. And I think I dropped out. I think I'm back now. Let me know if I'm okay. I dropped my connection dropped for a second. Use this opportunity to get some water. Okay, I think we're back now. So, yeah, as Brian points out, it's for me one of the great emotional moments. I said I kind of get choked up on Invisible Man for some reason. Oh, I get extraordinarily highly emotional in Bride of Frankenstein. First, it's the scene in the hermit's hut, which every time I have to tell myself I'm not going to cry, and most of the times I do. But the ending is so perfectly executed, and the final line, it's one of the most iconic lines, I think. And when the creature finally expresses, recognizes what has actually transpired, that he will never be accepted. It is his lot in life to carry on this turmoil and pain, and that Henry Frankenstein, while mistaken in things, didn't intend for any of this stuff, and the creature kind of picks up on this, and that Pretorius is up to no good, and that at least Frankenstein can potentially have some sort of happiness of sorts in his life. So the creature then makes that decision, and it's just an astonishing moment. Uh, Go, and then Karloff has that like pleading quality in his voice. He puts his hand out. He's like, "You live," and then we stay. You stay to Pretorius, who is, you know, essentially the devil himself. Um, and we belong dead, and then just oh, it's so dramatic the way that Ted Kent cuts the entire climax. It improves in every way on the climax at the creation scenes in Frankenstein, and it's built to such a rhythmic pace. But then it comes back in that final moment with the various close-ups, and then you cut back to the bride, who has that hiss in such a dramatic way, and then we cut back to Karloff, and then the creature actually sheds tears as he pulls the lever. I mean, it's just, and Henry and Elizabeth barely escape with their lives. It just gets me every single time. It's one of the times that I am so thankful that test audiences are a thing, and that they went back and recut the end of the picture and shot that different ending. Because if you look very closely, like I said, you can see little editing things. If you look in the explosion, you'll actually see Henry in the background, because it's a shot from, because when they shot it, Henry originally died along with everybody else. So there's a lot of little things like that you could see in Bride, which makes me love it more because it's always alive. But yeah, I don't think it's a secret to say I think Bride is the best sequel ever made. I think Bride is the ultimate example of the sequel surpassing the original in every single way. I know people like to talk about Empire Strikes Back or Godfather Part 2 or any other sequel they want to mention, but I do not think there is any other sequel that has ever completely been an artistic triumph in and of its own accord and improved upon its original source in every single aspect. I mean, right down to when they go back to the iconic Watchtower lab set, there's more Ken McStrickfaden gizmos and gadgets. The creation of the bride is even more elaborate. There's all the stuff on the top of the Watchtower. The editing is more impressive. The film's photography is absolutely to die for. Arthur Edison had collaborated with Whale, eventually moved out of Universal. So on Bride, Whale was working with the amazing cameraman John Mescal, and what he does on this film, I mean, my God, it is absolutely like every frame is a painting. Mescal described he used something called Rembrandt lighting. So he was very inspired by the way that Rembrandt would paint and have a lot of cross lighting to illuminate faces. And I'm trying to explain this as best I can. I'm probably butchering it, but do forgive me if I am. But I also think if you look at Bride, it has a much more silvery look. There's a lot of the grayscale of the black and white is a lot whiter. Whereas if you look at Invisible Man and Frankenstein, what Arthur Edison did, I think it's a lot. It's different. It's a different style. It's a different look. I love them both, but it's just another thing that separates Bride, I think. Of course, the problem is that Whale eventually got fed up with Mescal, who was apparently a really terrible alcoholic, and so eventually fired him. But while he was working at Universal, I mean, he just achieved miraculous results in this film in particular. So again, even right down to the photography, and since this is 1935, we are in the era of there actually being such a thing as a real film score that runs the length of the film, because it's not an early talkie. So Whale discovered and basically ran into Franz Waxman at a party and decided he should be the one to compose the score for Bride of Frankenstein. And Waxman's score just adds such a new level and new dimension to the Universal horror film. But this film in particular, I think Waxman's score is the musical equivalent of the soul of the film. He creates different themes for the individual characters, the iconic 5-note theme for Karloff's creature, the astonishing theme he makes for the bride with the church bells and the sort of lilting strings and everything, but with the little like tink chiming of the bells and things. I mean, it's it's one of the great film scores ever written. And it just adds a whole other layer to Bride of Frankenstein that was just not there before, because film scoring was an evolving process. Because really, it didn't come to full fruition, I think, until Max Steiner on King Kong, and that was 1933. Invisible Man, for example, only has music in the opening credits, and for the last 5 to 7 minutes of the film, the rest has no score. So having a full score in Bride of Frankenstein, that's barely 2 years later, and to have such a complete work with individual character themes, and then not just that, but I mean, my goodness, for the Danse Macabre piece alone, the piano driven xylophone oddball piece that I think it's like, I think that may be the perfect musical description and definition of James Whale. And of course, it's pretty much written entirely for the Dr. Pretorius character played by Ernest Thesiger, which, if there was any one element that makes Bride of Frankenstein the best of all Universal horrors, if you had to distill all of the James Whale style and James Whale isms, and him getting to just run wild and wreak havoc on Bride of Frankenstein, you could distill all of that to the character of Dr. Pretorius, who again was originally supposed to be played by Claude Rains, and you could picture Rains doing it. But I think his performance probably would have been much more straightforward and would have had that deep malevolence in flashes like in The Invisible Man, but with more of the whimsy and stuff. But once you have Ernest Thesiger in there, and you of course have the flashbacks and memories to the old dark house, I think it becomes an entirely different character. The malevolence is still there because of course he blackmails Henry into continuing the experiment, but he becomes literally the most lovable villain, I think, in the history of time. And I think that he belongs in all the lists of the greatest villains ever. Because literally he is a devil-like figure, like the ultimate tempter of fate, the ultimate devil on the shoulder, but with such charm and whimsy and just again, I think he personifies the fun that Whale has or had in thumbing his nose at the establishment and having witty jokes and one-liners and finding ways to not necessarily always mock, but like challenge the status quo and find new avenues to maybe push humanity through. It is a absolutely remarkable performance, and just you cannot think of the film without immediately just thinking of Dr. Pretorius, and you're just like, again, it's so many quotable lines, so many iconic moments. Practically every moment from this film is iconic. I think a lot of people just look at Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein as like one movie. They kind of mix and match the elements or the scenes. That maybe they haven't actually seen both films, but they just think of things and they just think, oh, that's Frankenstein, because it's so integral to people's vision of the character. And of course, that was also helped by Mel Brooks and Young Frankenstein, not just he and Gene Wilder using the framework of basically remaking Son of Frankenstein, but of course they reference the Hermit from Bride of Frankenstein because everybody knows that scene. And the scene with the Hermit, of course, is the scene where you're actually getting something from Shelley's novel, the creature learning how to speak and finding some flash of humanity that doesn't immediately try and destroy him or recoil in fear or terror or shoot him or it's something like that. But actually learning to speak. And like I said before, it's very James Whale in the way that while he's doing this, not only is he learning the vices of man, not only can you make the biblical allusions, but also James Whale himself was an avid cigar smoker. And so apparently that was, could be considered maybe a personal touch. And one of my favorite anecdotes ever is in the documentaries and things, and the horror historians are talking about Whale, and they mention this anecdote where his house was burning down once, and the only thing he decided to save, his most prized possession, was his box of cigars. And so he just walked outside in his bathrobe and lit one up and just puffed away as he watched his house burn down. Which that is one of those things you hear and you're just like, oh my god, I love this person. It's just like, I will I know only certain things about them, but I love this person and will love them forever. Little things like that. Um, so I think he injected himself more of himself into this film than any other, simply because he had the leeway to, and he basically got carte blanche to do whatever. And I don't think the studio were expecting what they got, but they were just happy to get a Frankenstein sequel, and they just rushed it out there. And of course, Bride didn't, do the numbers that Frankenstein did, and it was successful, but it had also been a while, and people and critics at the time were also like, well, this is just kind of different. Like, what is this? But it's fine, but they didn't react to it in the same way, and it was one of those films that over time has built a reputation, as it just has seeped into not just the hearts of monster kids everywhere, but horror fans, into the influence of the genre, but into the public consciousness, really. And I think when people come to this film brand new, particularly like if it's one of the first Universal horrors they see, which is how it was for me. um I saw Dracula, and then the next one I saw was Bride of Frankenstein, which absolutely wrecked me as a kid. I had never seen anything like it before, never seen anything like it since. And I was just like, is there more like this? Because I had loved Dracula, don't get me wrong, but I saw this and I was destroyed. I could not think about anything else. The ending destroyed me emotionally. Like I said before, kids cry at the end of King Kong when they see it for the first time, which, yeah, I got emotional when I saw it as a kid for the first time, but the ending of Bride of Frankenstein wrecked me emotionally. Um, and that's what cemented me on Universal Horror, because I saw that, and then I saw The Mummy next, which the mysticism and everything. So seeing Bride and The Mummy just cemented it for me. But then I had to. Then when I saw Invisible Man and Frankenstein, it's like, oh my god, there's more. There's more. I must know more about this person. Um, but every time I come back to Bride of Frankenstein, it's such an astonishing work of artistic brilliance on every level. The performances are great. The cast is great across the board. Colin Clive comes back and gives another great performance, even more anguished than his original Frankenstein performance. And sadly, it's one of his later films, because he didn't live too much longer after Bride of Frankenstein, which is such a shame, because he was a phenomenal actor, I think. He's also in the other great horror film of 1935, The Amazing Mad Love, which was Peter Lorre's first American film, which is an amazing film, even though it's a remake of Hands of Warlock. Which, if you haven't seen Mad Love, please do see it. It's one of the best horror films ever made. It's the only film that should be a Universal horror but isn't. It's MGM, of all places. But it fits right in, and was directed by Carl Freund, who of course had directed The Mummy and shot Dracula. But it's also cool that Colin Clive was in the two great horror films of 1935, and just as anguished in Mad Love, of course. I don't think anybody in the world could portray anguished as well as Colin Clive did. But anyway, Bride of Frankenstein is the definition of James Whale's artistry. I think he probably wouldn't like that he is remembered for his horror films instead of everything else, but I think he's remembered for his horror films primarily because we can't see all his other films because they're just not available. But I wish more people were aware of his name. But at least, in the horror realm, they are. Let me go ahead and pull this before I forget. So, of course, this is my original VHS copy. I haven't yet gotten the Encore Edition LD. I don't really need it, but I kind of want to have it anyway, just because. So, the version to watch now, of course, is the Blu-ray restoration, which again, Mescal's photography just leaps out of the screen in HD. Again, it's not 100% perfect. I do hope that when they do these in 4K and they need to do them in 4K, that it just needs to happen. Like a lot of 4K revisits, I hope they, come back and make a few improvements. But it's still the best we've had on home video to date. It brings all the old extras back. The commentary track on here by Scott McQueen is phenomenal. I think it's one of my favorite commentary tracks of all time, jam packed with information. All the commentaries on the classic Universal horrors are great, but that one in particular is one of my all time favorites. Um, Hang on one second. I forgot. I needed to pull one other thing. Where did you go? Dang it. Ah, here it is. I meant to pull this earlier. It's just when I go to pull everything, I usually forget one or two things, and then I'm like, oh crap, do I have enough time to go grab it? So this was a complete shock when this was released last year. This is part of the make sure I get the name right. It's part of the Universal Pictures Heritage Collection. It's a partnership that Universal did with the La La Land soundtrack label, the amazing boutique soundtrack label that does these amazing archive limited releases of iconic film scores. Only trouble is usually they're so expensive that I can't afford them, and then they go out of print, and I'm like, I should have just bought it anyway. What did I do? But this line is all Universal scores from the Universal Library, mostly titles that have never been released in any shape or form. But as soon as this was announced, I bought it immediately. I'm astonished this ever came out because you just do not get scores from the 1930s simply because elements do not survive, and then if they do, they're not very good. You don't even get scores from the 40s on disc, but I could not believe this occurred. It's far cheaper than most of these boutique soundtrack releases. It's still available. It is a limited release of 3,000. So please get a copy of this before they're gone. This is their release of Franz Waxman's Bride of Frankenstein score. This is a release I never thought would happen in a million years. And it's astonishing. It's got a brilliant bit of liner notes going into the recording sessions. It's got a section from the amazing theatrical poster, which is one of my favorite posters of all time. And it even has bonus tracks. It has some outtakes, which I'm amazed they survived. It's all on a single CD. It's about a 50-minute program. I believe I think it's almost all of the complete score. I don't think it's 100% complete, but it's amazing that there was a source that survived because simply this stuff just doesn't happen, particularly for scores of the 1930s. And then have this shot in the inlay to get some of the glare off. And again, it's at a far cheaper price point than there's usually are. Usually their releases are like 40, 50, $60 or more. But this one is like retails at 19.99, and you can actually get it sometimes cheaper when it's on sale, but really great liner notes. And they go into the scoring sessions. And like I said before, James Whale implemented himself into every aspect of the film's production, and no one did this in the 1930s. Like there were some who did it to certain degrees. Like Hitchcock would have ideas and participate in things to a certain extent. So would John Ford. So would William Wyler. Your big industry titans and things. But this includes a picture from the original scoring sessions, and it's an orchestra of about 30 some odd performers. And it's really cool to see an image of a scoring session from the 1930s. But if you look here, trying to do this to where the glare doesn't show. But so here you have the screen, obviously, as we're used to seeing, footage of scoring sessions. But it's interesting that the room is like wood paneled, and it's a very small screen, and everybody's facing away from it, actually. So here's the orchestra of about 30 players. You have this large boom crane mic, and Waxman's there. But here, right here in this chair, apparently smoking one of his favorite cigars, is James Whale himself there, sitting in on the entire scoring sessions for Bride of Frankenstein. I mean, I mean, that just said that speaks volumes because again, this is 1935. People just did not do that. Again, this was a James Whale production. It was, his picture. Yes, it was a Universal picture. Yes, it was under Lemley Jr., but I mean, it was it was a James Whale production. Um, and here's a really lovely shot of Waxman with Karloff. This is a lovely book, just like La La Land always does. Uh, Please definitely go get a copy of this before they are sold out because it will sell out eventually. I'm surprised it hasn't already because it's only a print run of 3,000. But again, this was a release I thought would never occur. I was like, eventually, I'm just gonna. I used to try and dub the like put my tape on and record just the credits to get the clean Waxman themes from the opening and closing credits just because I wanted the soundtrack so badly. So I was just amazed when this came out. So yeah, I could talk for 10 hours about Bride of Frankenstein alone. I think it's easy. It's one of the greatest films ever made. It just is. It's the crown jewel of Universal horror. It's one, if you want to talk about any film and the auteur theory, I don't see how anything is more obvious than Bride of Frankenstein. It is infused with James Whale's thoughts, ideas, personality in every single aspect. It is one of the films that never stops giving. You see something new every single time. It never fades in your memory. It never loses its punch. It never loses its impact. It never dilutes. In fact, it only grows in time over time. Um, you recognize things you may have not picked up on as a kid, but I mean, it's just one of the immortal works of the cinema. It is. And every time I'm astonished, how was all of this done at Universal in 1935? How did all of this get through the production code, which, they had to find ways of getting around the production code, but there are things that Whale and company did. The bit that's brought up in the documentaries where Pretorius has the line, about uh, follow the lead of nature or of God. And originally it was the line read, if you like your fairy tales, which of course was blasphemous. So the Hayes office insisted, no, you can't have that. So they changed it to Bible stories. But the way that it's read, the way that Ernest Thesiger says it, the intonation is there, and in fact it's even more blasphemous than if they had said fairy tales because follow the follow me and follow the lead of nature or of God if you like your Bible stories. It's just like, oh, it's so, again, the thumbing of the nose at the establishment and everything that's preconceived is just enormous when you start to look at it. And again, a lot of critics and a lot of people have written papers and they like to try and read stuff in, like they try to, again, the big thing is usually because Whale himself was openly gay, they try to read gay subtext into things and stuff like that, which is fine. But again, it's all supposition because it's, none of us have any idea. So it's theory. I don't necessarily think that's in there, but some of those critical pieces are fun to read and just to see what other people think. I don't think Whale was doing anything like that, but it's certainly possible for sure. I think it was much more, again, this notion of sort of challenging authority and thumbing the nose at things like that. But because he had the patron saint of Limley Jr. backing him and had the success of Frankenstein and Invisible Man behind him, he could do this stuff. And he was doing stuff that people just didn't do and couldn't get away with because they didn't have that level of freedom. And again, the only thing I can even come close to is that's similar is Wells on Citizen Kane at RKO with his legendary contract of you can do anything so long as it's under $1 million. I mean, it's kind of the same thing. There were certain people in the silent era who had that sort of control. There were independent producers who could do that. Um, but in the studio system in the 30s, there were some, but nobody really had this fruitful period like Whale did. And that leads into the next film after Bride, which was the big super production, and something Whale was actually really keen to do because it had been hugely successful on the stage. And that, of course, is 1936, is Showboat. And I hope this is going to stay on here because it's a pretty thick box, but I'll just try. This is the lovely complete Laserdisc box set MGM did back in the early 90s that includes segments of the original silent Showboat, the 51 remake, and Whale's 1936 Universal version, which is amazing. I'm not one for musicals, but my goodness, all the creativity that I talk about, all the camera innovation and character and intelligence and wit. He turned all his attention to making the definitive screen adaptation of Showboat. This, of course, just recently restored in 4K. It's on Blu-ray from Criterion, but before that, there was a Warner Archive MOD DVD, which was basically using this Laserdisc master, but this has really nice extras plus the other versions and stuff. And not all of this stuff has carried over. So this is still a really nice collector's piece and very uncommon. It took me forever to find a good copy of this that wasn't, super expensive or usually these are well over $50. I'm sure it's probably come down some since the Criterion Blu-ray has come out, but this is still a really cool version to have because you do get the other stuff and some really extensive liner notes and things like that. So this was Universal's big super production. It was ridiculously successful, but it's really, in a lot of ways, the last huzzah for Whale at Universal because this was the last film he really made under the Laemmles, who actually lost the studio in 1936. They had made a deal, and with these financiers, and the thing was, they borrowed this money in order to keep the studio afloat, and they were paying it back, but they apparently didn't realize the proviso that the financiers after a certain point could take over the studio if they wanted. They didn't think that they would do that, and they did. And so the Laemmles were, hoisted out of the studio that they built themselves, and thus ushered in the era of what's termed as the new Universal. And this is what caused the entire tonality and studio landscape of Universal to change almost overnight. And 1937 onwards, it's a different studio, which is why when they started making horror films again with Son of Frankenstein in 1939, after that and the Wolfman, they quickly devolved into just cranking out B programmers because the new Universal was interested only in economics and making multiple feature programs. And they made more money off of their Deanna Durbin pictures, for example, than anything else. So it became quantity of good product, and quality just didn't matter all that much. If there was quality, it was more a luck of the draw than anything else. And Whale couldn't work under those conditions. He was not that type of artist or director or anything. So Showboat really is his last great film because after this, he loses the patronage and he loses all that creative freedom. And then he had to work off the rest of his contract. There was one more film after Showboat, but let me show you the back of this. Again, I'm trying to make sure this doesn't just flop off because it is a very thick box. It is 7 sides. It is a heck of a mammoth Laserdisc box set. If you're into LDs and box sets, it's a really, really cool piece to have. Let me show you the insert really quick. Lovely extensive liner notes. Some of it's about Whale, and then, of course, by the other versions. And then it also includes a lot of music recording session pieces and things. So the analog tracks are filled. So trying to get some of the glare off. But yeah, look at this. It is just, that's the chapter breakdown just for And then, yeah, side 7 is supplemental material. There's video material as well. There's scoring sessions. It is just loaded. And again, not all of this carried over to the Criterion release. In fact, I think most of the audio is still exclusive to this LD box set. So you really do have to have this in addition to the Criterion release. I think if you're a completist, again, I'm not really one for musicals, but Showboat is a iconic piece of American theater, and Whale just knocks it out of the park. I've seen pieces of the 51 version, but I've never been able to stomach sitting all the way through it because it's just like, oh God, just trying to even thinking about comparing the two versions. It's like, oh God, I don't even want to do that. It's just painful. And I know some people like the 50s version, but it's not the same. My goodness, it's not the same. So this is still a really nice piece to have, but it really is the last James Whale production. This is Sorry, it's kind of hard when you have too much stuff set aside. So anyway, after Showboat 1936, there was one more production that Whale had planned and did shoot, which was 1937's The Road Back, which is the sequel to All Quiet on the Western Front, the great indictment of World War I that Universal had made the iconic masterpiece out of in the early 30s. And so this was them finally doing the follow up and doing the sequel, and Whale was doing it. And it was going to be, again, another great indictment of war and the great costs on humanity. And, you know, it was, I believe, R.C. Sheriff came back and worked on the screenplay. It was, Whale going full tilt again and making a really, what I would say is, for the 1930s, more of an epic film of sorts, a grander scale, a grander budget and everything. But he ran into the problem of dealing with the new Universal, who also were very wary of upsetting the German film market, which is something most people are not aware of at this point in Hollywood history. All the studios were still making great money off of their releases in Germany, and even though the Nazis had come to power, they didn't want to piss anybody off and lose that important market. So whatever they did, they got approval or disapproval from the German ambassadors and things, and they tiptoed around even mentioning or talking about the Nazis' rise to power or any sort of German politics. And if anything, it would there would be nothing negative said whatsoever ever. So if you had anything, it would get heavily censored or cut or just rejected. Okay. I think I dropped out there for a second. I think I'm back. Okay. But anyway, long story short, this affected a number of films, and it wasn't really until Warner Brothers being the ones to sort of break that with Confessions of a Nazi Spy and things like that, where they just said, "Oh, screw it, we're going to do stuff anyway because this is ridiculous, and we don't care if we lose our money in Germany. We don't think you're doing the right thing." So basically, Warner Brothers were the ones who sort of broke that open, but that was 1939. So 1937, Whale is making The Road Back, which ostensibly is not the prettiest picture of Germany, obviously. Talking about the aftermath of World War I and things like that. So it was basically taken away, recut, and then other directors were brought in and shot new material, which was inserted, and I believe also bits of comedy were inserted. There is no good home video version of The Road Back, and I've only seen pieces of it. I've never seen the whole thing. There's no real release of it anywhere, and for all intents and purposes, what they did to it is, again, to make the Wells parallel, is very much like the fate of the Magnificent Ambersons in 1942, right down to the fact that other directors were brought in to shoot new material that doesn't fit tonally at all, and things were inserted, and the film was heavily edited and then released in that butchered state and just bombed and got terrible reviews and everything. And everything indicates, and Curtis's biography as well, that not only did it gut Whale emotionally, but I'm sure he could see the writing on the wall, and he was always quoted as saying that stuff like that, and the changeovers and everything, the artistry was gone, and he was quoted as saying it took all the fun out of making pictures, and so then he had to work off the rest of his contract breaking program films, most of which are supposedly very terrible or just run of the mill generic junk. Um, I'm sure there's probably some sparks of greatness in there somewhere, but you can't see these films. They're not available. Again, it's like how I finally saw Journey's End. I guess I'm gonna have to track down some other like really crappy versions wherever they are on the internet. However, somebody uploaded or like maybe found an old 16 millimeter print of one or something. But basically, he wound up working off the rest of his contract and then retiring, and then just living in semi reclusion. That's the period that's depicted in the film Gods and Monsters. So that's sort of that the sort of house where he lived with a pool in the backyard and stuff. And he was he was financially well off enough that he could just live out the remainder of his days. But it's just an agonizing thought to think one of the great directors of history just basically being down and out and just kicking back and not being able to do anything for the remainder of his years. Just one of the absolute shames of the industry history that this happened to somebody this brilliant, this much of a genius, proven time and time again, and just treated terribly by those who didn't understand him. Again, to make the Orson Welles parallel, I think is immediately obvious. But and then eventually he did have I think it was either, I know it was a stroke or maybe a series of strokes, and then after that he died in 1957. So think of all the films that could have been for that 15-20 year period. I mean, it's just such a criminal loss to cinema history, I think. But it happened to other people as well. But uh, I think I really hope more of his films are presented well. Again, we are finally going to get some more, I believe. I know Kino is doing one of them as part of their deal with Universal. So hopefully, fingers crossed, more can happen, because I really think some of his other films of the 30s are truly great, but they're just unavailable. Be great to see a restoration on Journey's End, for example. Waterloo Bridge would be great, because that is a great film. And I would love to actually see a decent version of The Road Back, and maybe with some extras about the original version would be really great, like what we've finally gotten on Magnificent Ambersons, of course. So anyway, that's sort of what happened to Whale and his career trajectory. And again, it was really this 5-year period, 1931 to 1936, where he had such artistic freedom like no one's really ever had before or since, and he used it to its fullest extent. But didn't make a giant thing about it, like he was this great artiste, and didn't have a gigantic ego, and became so passionately involved with every department and every field that he was not just simply the director. He was literally like if he probably would have been Atlas carrying the world of the film on his very back. And the more you read about him, the more fascinating of a person and character that he becomes. Again, James Curtis's biography is a must read. I really need to get a physical copy, because again, doing this, I'm like, I want to read it again now, darn it. But yes, the more of his films I actually do get to see, the harder to find and rare films, the more fascinated I am. Again, he's one of my favorite artists, not just directors. I do think he is one of the people that defines the term of director as artist, as auteur. If you really want to use the auteur theory, which again, I think the auteur theory, it's a nice idea, but a director doesn't do everything by himself, obviously. And I hate how that kind of demeans everybody else. But I do think there are certain cases where, it's literally part of a person in the film, and you can't discount that. It is there. There's so much of them in there, and that comes fullest, I think, in Bride of Frankenstein. It just is. Um, so every time I come back to these films, every single year, it's endearing of sorts. It's definitely like the seeing an old friend once more again. I know that's probably a bit weird saying as he died in 1957, but um, you do get the sense that you actually know him in a way. And again, one of the 10 or 15 people I would most like to have dinner with, when you get asked that sort of desert island question scenario, who would you want to meet? Well, Kubrick, Hitchcock, Wells, James Whale. He's right in there. I mean, and again, um, I feel like I already know him in a sense. So anyway, that's my spiel for the night. Make of it what you will. Again, not meant to be comprehensive or anything, and primarily referencing the 4 horror films because those are the main core films that we're able to see. Because it's unfortunate that outside of those, all you really have is Waterloo Bridge and Showboat. Really, everything else is just not really available. But so, with that being said, I will get back to the all the comments that have come up and give my throat a second to rest. Let's see. Okay, let me find where we left off because I always want to try and get to everybody at least as much as I can because I know it always sucks when you feel like you have a good question, but it's also so hard to do live streams and then try and make sure you get to everybody and then it jumps around and but I try to do my best. Okay, I think I found where I left off. Let's see. Oh wait, no, it jumped out again. Sorry. um, oh, cool. I see some good talk about Invisible Agent. That is, again, it's totally a World War II propaganda film. But like I said, I think if you look at, because they're packaged in these franchise collections, um, I think film for film, the Invisible Man series is the strongest of the Universal, franchise collection series or whatever you want to call them. Invisible Agent, well, the first time you see it, you're like, wow, that was really good. And then you start to think, well, the story's kind of hokey in a few places, but it's a World War II B program or propaganda film with the Invisible Man. It is what it is. But you have Cedric Hardwicke, you have Peter Lorre. That alone makes it great. And amazing John Fulton effects. That's the point where they switch from doing the bandages to doing the cold cream instead, which just is an amazing effect. And again, all still done by hand, but you can see the effects getting better with each film. Again, the more I see it, the more I think you can sort of pick holes in the screenplay. But again, it's a B program or propaganda piece. It is what it is. But I still love it. And again, it's got Peter Lorre in it, even though he is sort of doing because they have him playing a Japanese agent. So there is, you could probably say there probably is a little bit of his Mr. Moto in there. But I've always thought those Mr. Moto films are really underrated. I love him in these parts, even though obviously he is cast in a different ethnicity, and that's a whole can of worms. And I understand that, but he does do it with a stillness and a grace and an intelligence that it's still a serious performance. And he's doing this, and it's quite a dark, interesting character. It's a film in and of itself. Inside of a B programmer, which is kind of cool. So people aren't just phoning it in. Yeah, the Abbott and Costellos, they are classic. It took me a while to get used to them because I grew up, and then the more I got into the Universal horrors, I was like, yeah. And then Abbott and Costello came in, and they just killed off all the monsters, and they made everything a joke. So it took me a while to be able to take them seriously. Um, ANC Meet Frankenstein is the best of them because it's the first, and you have Bela in there, and you have Lon Chaney Jr. in there, and it's the most classic. But there is mileage to be gained, I think, out of the others. I still hate that they don't have all of them in the monster collections. They've got all the ones with the monster characters, but it's missing the one Meet the Killer Boris Karloff and Meet Jekyll and Hyde, but it's got Meet Invisible Man and Frankenstein and Meet the Mummy. So at least they're in there. Um, but I would like to get copies of those others actually. Yeah, as Wolf says, there are occasional revivals of the Journey's End play, so you can see a version of it or read the actual play. So it's not like it's totally lost and you can't see anything. But yeah, there's a version floating around like that pops up on YouTube sometimes. It's terrible, but I watched it anyway. I was just like, finally, and I'm like, I can't see half of what's going on. Oh well. Yeah, but as Pete brings up too, yeah, the more you think about Frankenstein technically, it's brilliant. It's so ahead of its time. Not just the visuals, not just the performances, not just the fact that it is a pre-code film, so they could go a bit darker, and there is the German expressionism influence, but the camera work, there is a lot of moving camera for an early talkie. A lot of the visuals, and again, even the sound design is actually a factor. And you could like count 5 or 10 films maybe of the 30s that have an element of sound design, let alone real moments of sound design. It's incredible. But again, you just don't think about it until you sit there and go, well, that's a pretty good bit, and that part of the story is pretty good, and there they get a bit of Mary Shelley's novel in there, so that's good. And then, hey, wait, there's a lateral camera move, and then here's something they did with the sound, and oh look, this is a complete pullback. It's a total moving camera shot, and it's not bound down. It's a lot of stuff that until you actually do that, but your brain is picking all this stuff up, and you finish it, and you're like, oh my god, that's such a great movie. I forgot how much of a great movie that is. But if you look at it closer, then you go further beyond that. But again, your brain is picking up on this, even if you're not cognizant of it. Let's see. Yeah, Brian talks about the original ending of Frankenstein just ends at the windmill where they both ostensibly die before the tag ending was added. Oh, Mike Doug's here. Hey man, how's it going? Sorry I didn't see when you jumped in. I was probably already spieling on. Um, Yeah, I always mess up some of the monologues. I'm trying to get better on some of those, but usually if I do them spontaneously, I can remember pretty well. But when I do like a live stream or I put myself on the spot, then I always goof stuff up, and then I'm like, no, wait, oh crap, oh I messed up the words there. No, it's something different. Let's see. Yes, more good talk about the Five Tall Tales set. Yes, that is an amazing box. Um, LD version of Old Dark House is not great quality. No, it's I still would like to get a copy of it, but I'm pretty sure it's the exact same thing that Kino put out on DVD because it's got the same extras. The commentaries were on Laserdisc first, and it's that really crummy thing. Apparently, they used a collector's 16 millimeter print, and it's really worn and really dark. And a lot of shots you can only see the center of what's going on in the screen, and all the edges are just blacked out. It was really rough, but that's what we had to live with for the longest time. So I want to get the LD just because great cover, and I'm a sucker for Laserdisc, and Old Dark House is a cherished favorite, so of course I have to get it on LD. But it's usually kind of pricier for no reason. But I'm convinced it's going to be the same as the Kino DVD I watched for years. But it's one of the most dramatic upgrades you can make. I think if you've ever seen it on LD or DVD, and then you go to the new 4K restoration, your head's going to fall off. You're just going to be so shocked. Same thing with going from the awful Mystery of the Wax Museum blue DVD where they screwed up the color to the new restoration where it looks like it was made yesterday. Oh, Mike watched the Cohen Old Dark House last night. Excellent. Yes. um, when I think about the 63 Castle version, I will admit I only watched the William Castle version once, and I need to watch it again because I just kind of wrote it off after that. And I'm like, oh, how could they possibly remake this? Oh, Old Dark House is an artistic triumph. How could they possibly do that? Well, art and commerce. Plus, it was a movie from the 30s that didn't do well at first, so of course they remade it. So I need to rewatch it again. I just remember it having a lot of silly slapstick, and just they kind of turned it into a more of a spooky haunted house stereotypical movie, which there have been tons of those, but that's more patterned after not really Cat and the Canary, but stuff more like the Cat and the Canary remake, the Bob Hope version, which that and the Ghostbreakers sort of have been ripped off a million times, and those just have really nice Kino Lorber Blu-ray releases. I would love to get with new scans. They look great. But it seemed to me the 63 Old Dark House was much more in that wheelhouse, if as it were. But I do need to see it again because again, I saw it once years and years ago, and then I was like, oh, why did they do this? Oh, Pete's gonna check out Old Dark House. Yes, it's phenomenal. And your neck of the woods, I don't know. It might be easier to get the Masters of Cinema release. I don't know what's easier for you to get. Plus, Cohen's distribution is kind of hard to get, and they're usually pricier. So their discs are U.S. only. So you might have an easier time getting the Masters of Cinema release. It's the same 4K restoration and stuff. And like I said, the packaging's better on it. I still really want to get it, even though it's double dipping, just because it's just, oh, it looks so pretty. It's Masters of Cinema. I need them both. I don't really need it, but I need it. I need it, I swear. There's a way back, you fool. There must be a way back. Una O'Connor, an Invisible Man. She does add comedy. Even her husband can't stand her yelling. Oh, not just her yelling, but her constant, messing about and flusteriness and being super bossy. And he's like, "Oh, let him cool down a minute." And his head is still bandaged up. And she's like, "Yo, go up there right now. Oh, I'm leaving this time, and I mean it this time." And it's like, well, if you have a psychopath living upstairs, maybe do let him cool off first before you tell him you're evicting him right now because he hasn't paid the bill. But no, she insists and he has to go. And it's like, okay, this can't end well. Excuse me, sir, but there's breathing in my barn. Yes. Yes, Invisible Man should be up there with Dracula and Frankenstein. Yeah, but it just doesn't. It's not held in the same immediate name recognition value. And yes, same with Claude's performance. Yes, it's right there with Bela as Dracula, Karloff as Frankenstein's creation, and Claude Rains as the Invisible Man. I would say Karloff again as Imhotep and the Mummy. Of course, Lon Chaney Jr. is Larry Talbot and the Wolfman. Those are the iconic monster figures. Yeah, with the great performances to match them. Elsa Lanchester as the bride is of course great as well, but she's only at the end for like 5 minutes. So it's obviously a bit more limited. And of course there are other great performances. And again, I mean, Colin Clive is so undervalued. I mean, his Henry Frankenstein is so unbelievably tortured, and uh, and of course, you must mention once again, one of the great villains of the movies, Ernest Thesiger as Doctor Pretorius. I mean, my word, oh man. And of course, the entire film clan in the Old Dark House are characters for the ages. Let's see. Oh, Pete mentioned the Batman Returns connection. Yeah, and I know I mentioned that at some point, but that's what it makes me think of. The Whale being begged to do a sequel for so long, they give him carte blanche, which is what Warner Brothers kind of did on with Tim Burton, getting him to do Batman Returns, and then both films come out, and they're both very weird, and they definitely don't do the business of the first one. So it is history repeating itself. Yeah, oh yes, the whole studio begging to make a sequel and Whale saying no went back and forth for 4 years. I think there is a great. I should have mentioned this. I think there is a great lost film. I really do want to read the treatment for it. But Whale was working on a science fiction film with R.C. Sheriff, which was A Trip to Mars, which would have been made in some point in time around, I think, after The Invisible Man, and the great lost film, the one that would have been made, the one that was almost made, and then we did get a film made, but by other people, and I've come to actually really appreciate it in a weird way, but it was a film that took me a long time to get accustomed to. Um, but originally, the film Dracula's Daughter, the Dracula sequel that we eventually got in 1936, which was the last horror film under the Lemneys that was ever released. So technically, Dracula's Daughter is the last of Golden Age Universal horror. But originally, Dracula's Daughter was to have been an R.C. Sheriff story directed by James Whale, and apparently they were so far out there that their treatment was completely rejected, and eventually Whale moved on to other things and it just didn't happen, and eventually we got the Dracula's Daughter we know, which does have good moments. And again, I have come to terms with it, and I now actually do like it. But it's the film where they couldn't even bother to have Bela Lugosi come back as Dracula and literally have a terrible wax figure of him in the coffin that they burn at one point for 2 seconds. And it's like, the degree to which the lost opportunities are there with Dracula's Daughter cannot even be comprehended. Imagine James Whale going even further than what he did on Bride of Frankenstein, but doing a Dracula sequel. I mean, my God, the mind boggles. I think James Whale doing Dracula's Daughter is one of the great lost films that was not made. Um, it's I can't even begin to think of something that even compares. I would say um, the only thing that comes to mind is the third Timothy Dalton Bond film. There's a handful of what ifs, but that one almost happened, and my God, it would have been glorious. But there probably would have been a lot more scrutiny paid, and of course, the studio was already changing hands. The writing was already on the wall, but we could have gotten one more under the wire because Dracula's Daughter did come out in 1936 under the Limley, still just barely. It was the last one, and there was good stuff in there. Again, I did come to terms with it, but the mind boggles at what Whale would have done with it. That's a good question Brian brings up about, Universal kept bringing the creature back, but why not the bride? And who knows? Maybe they just thought that having a female monster would be too risque for the production code era, and maybe they didn't want to. I don't know. Maybe they thought people forgot. I could not tell you. But you would think if they kept bringing the original creation back, and apparently it was indestructible, why wouldn't the bride be as well? That probably would have given us a lot more dramatic meat for some of the later sequels, which I think starting with Ghost of Frankenstein, the quality takes such a nosedive that your results really are going to vary with how much you're really into Universal films of the 40s. I think Son of Frankenstein is the last great film of the Frankenstein cycle. I think Son of Frankenstein is actually probably the most underrated of all Universal films because it's really the birth of the silver age of horror, but people don't really talk about it. And if they see it, they go, "Oh, this is young Frankenstein." It's like, no, it's the framework, but Son of Frankenstein is a great film and it reinvigorated everything. And there's really four great lead performances in it. Karloff comes back and plays the creature for the last time, but he's back to being mute, which is a shame, but he's still great. Lionel Atwill has his great heroic role as Inspector Krogh, and it may be his best leading man type performance, even though it's a supporting part. it really is Basil Rathbone's picture, who gives a great, phenomenal performance and a lead role type that he really didn't get to do all the time. And it may be the best performance of Bela Lugosi's career as Igor, he was just cast as Igor, and it was a tiny part. And thankfully, Roland V. Lee, who was the director, got so pissed at how Lugosi was being treated that he actually built up the part for Lugosi over time. And, that's how we got the character in the film we know and love. And I just think it's so undervalued. It's not the same thing that Whale did. It's really a soft reboot of the whole thing in a lot of ways, and Universal would make this into an art form with all of these Silver Age films. Sometimes every film was a soft reboot of sorts, and continuity was not important. It would get name dropped, but real continuity was just it was not there. But I think Son of Frankenstein is the last, like 100% true quality Frankenstein film Universal made. Everything else after that, starting with Ghost of Frankenstein, it's much more of a mixed bag. There's stuff in there I love. I watch them every year, but every year it's like you can see, it's like there's the jumping off point after Son of Frankenstein. Yes, the different versions of Showboat, as Wolf says, is a rabbit hole of mammoth proportions. Yes. Musical people can go on and on about the stage versions and the film versions and everything. I totally agree. Yes, I am not very well versed in that. I will admit. I've gone through the extras. I get it, but I'm like, that is a different world for me. Like, I know some musicals, but it's not really my thing. But yeah, I know people can debate that till the proverbial cows come home. Pete says, is Whale Showboat my favorite musical? It's one of the handful of musicals I actually like. Yes, I will say that. I mean, musicals are fine. It's just not really my thing. But the really great ones are the ones that I think also are great films as well and use the medium well, which I think Whale does that in Showboat better than most anybody. So yeah, it's in there in the short list of musicals that I really like. So for me, it's uh, Whale, Showboat, Yankee Doodle Dandy, Singing in the Rain. I guess maybe American in Paris as well. But outside of those three, it's the only other ones that I really like are the Astaire Rogers films, especially the really good ones of the RKO series, and then especially the Busby Berkeley films. That's pretty much what I go for, and because they have good stories and they use the medium well, and it's not just song and dance numbers and nothing else. Which I know there's an art form to the musical, I know, but it's just never really been my thing. Yeah, of course, I should also probably mention the Q-Core 50s version of Star is Born as well, because that's technically also a musical. So there are ones, and I am trying to become more well versed in that. But growing up, I was just like, oh, it's a musical. Oh God, stay away! It's like the plague. No, I can't stand it. So I am trying to get more versed. One can only imagine what Wells would have achieved if he had full control of money. Yeah, I mean, but at least he had it for a while. But I can imagine having it once and then never being able to get it again. Imagine what that does to somebody. Not for lack of trying, of course. Whale had it for 5 years, but if that kind of stuff doesn't last. I have to say though, I do another one of the great what ifs. Imagine if Wells, after the RKO tenure had changed and everything. Imagine what would have happened if he had stayed on, but gone to making good, solid, lower budgeted films, but he could still be as creative as possible, but just without the fanfare of it being Orson Welles from radio with his amazing boy wonder talents. And then imagine if he had stayed on just a little while longer at RKO, and imagine if he had somehow come into the orbit and become enmeshed with the Val Lewton unit. That's one of my all-time great what if dreams. That's something I have dreamed about as a what if. What if Orson Welles and Val Lewton had been in a room together at RKO in the 1940s? It's like, again, the mind boggles. What if Wells had tried his hand at doing stuff like Luton was doing and using the B programmer as a new art form and making great films that slipped under the nose of everybody because they were B films, or not even just B films, but films without the prestige attached of being the great Orson Welles production that's supposed to change the world, and without all the heavy focus on it, still being able to be fully creative and artistic, which in a way I think is what he tried to do and tried to escape his own shadow in that way with his later films. But it became very much a matter of studio hopping and then eventually, you know, making films on the run in Europe and never having the proper facilities and stuff. But it's interesting to think about these what ifs. But that's sort of what I like to turn over my head sometimes. But that's a real what if, because I've never read of them encountering one another, but I know they had to have, and I would think that Orson would have seen cat people somehow. I would hope he had, because I mean I know he would have been as bowled over it by like all of us are, but that's something I was just like, man, if I could have been a fly on the wall, if they ever met at RKO, like, why couldn't it have been? Because, Wells was making Emerson's at RKO in 1942. So it is feasible. And of course, the Luton films famously reused the Amberson staircase and Cat People and Seventh Victim and other elements of those. And of course, Robert Wise worked on the Luton films and edited Kane and Amberson's, anyway, the list goes on, but that's one of those what ifs that I like to think about. Oh, Wolf had to check out. Thanks for dropping in, man. I'm probably better start winding it down myself. Every time I think, oh, I'm just going to get on for a bit, then I start talking, and then I'm like, why is my throat kind of hoarse? I'm like, oh, I've been talking 3.5 hours. That's why. So, oh man. But just gonna get through these last couple of things, because again, I never want to cut anybody off. Want to try and get everybody in. Yeah, the at least with Emerson's, we do have the lovely Mercury Theater adaptation. So it's obviously not the same thing Wells was doing with the film, but we do have at least a time capsule picture of why Wells loved the story so much, why he warmed to Tarkington's writing, and sort of that time capsule of what the Mercury Theater on the air did first. So that is cool that we have that. And actually, speaking of October, everybody talks about obviously the infamous 1938 War of the Worlds they did, but what they don't talk about is their version of Dracula, which is actually really good. If you haven't heard it, it's on YouTube, it's all over the place. You can find it online. Usually the quality is not super great, but they did a really good radio version of Stoker's Dracula novel, and they managed to get pretty much the whole gist of the long rambling book in about an hour or so. So if you're looking for a nice spooky listen, check out the Mercury Theater version of Stoker's Dracula. It's really, really good for a radio adaptation. Ooh, I've possibly thought about doing stuff on the Mad Max films. Oh, I definitely should. I adore the Max series. That would be a good idea. I'm really anticipating Kino is doing the 4K UHD and new remaster, new transfer of the original film, which I've really hoped somebody would do for the longest time, because I don't think the current versions have the right color timing. It looks a little washed out, and the only good source of the original Australian mono that we have is the lossy DVD track. It's lossy on the Blu-ray as well. So it's going to have lossless Australian mono, brand new 4K transfer. They're doing a UHD release, new extras. I think they said they got an interview with George Miller, and that's supposed to come out sometime in November. So I'm like, please be good. And the new Blu-ray is going to be brand new as well. It's not recycling the old ones. That's great news. I'm hoping to get that and do a review of that when that comes out, because I've been hoping somebody would revisit Mad Max for the longest time with a new transfer and stuff. So that's going to be really freaking cool. So yeah, that would be definitely cool to do. Picked up the first two letterbox versions and an LD, so Spencer commentary would be great. Yeah. Now that I've done a few commentary tracks, I'm like, oh, I could do one for this, I could do one for that. And I'm like, well, if I do that, I could do one for everything. But I'm also like, eventually, I feel like I would either run out of stuff to say, or it would get boring, or I just start regurgitating like the actual commentary or documentary. So I would like to do some more because it's quite fun, but it's very very difficult when you're doing it solo. And I'm like the whole time I'm like, well, I hope people like this. Hope they don't get more bored by me just spieling on because you try to talk about films in your regular day-to-day life and people just usually stare at you, or they're like, oh no, he's on another lecture again. And I'm like, no, 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 I'm just talking for 5 minutes. I swear, 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 5 minutes. I swear. Um, so I feel like I kind of cut loose with some of those, but those were really fun to do. And um, it wound up kind of being more screen specific and also anecdotal and production stuff. So it's kind of a mix, but I have been wanting to toy. I've been toying around with the idea of doing some more because they're quite fun to do, but they are very taxing because I do those. I did those totally off the cuff and no notes, no anything, and just went for it as a straight shot. So I think I might try some more. I'm not sure what I should try first, but um, hopefully I can squeeze in some time and maybe do another one or two and see how it goes. Go into detail about why the first two are such great films, why Fury Road doesn't live up to its hype is something I would love to hear about in detail. Ah, you know me too well. I was trying to, I was trying to be polite and say, yeah, I can talk about Mad Max, even though I can't stand Fury Road at all. So, I mean, yeah, no, it's not terrible or anything. It's just not a Mad Max movie, I don't think. I had wondered what a fourth Max film would be like for ages, but I mean, it's not the same without Mel in the role. I mean, you could still do a good Max film and recast it and make a new one. That's fine. But the Fury Road it was just like George Miller having fun doing a bunch of crazy stuff, and everybody goes like, "Oh wow, this is an artistic achievement." And I'm like, they drove across the desert and they drove back across the desert. Very little was actually achieved. Max stood around and mumbled a lot and didn't really do all that much. He was the passive character in his own movie. I mean, the list goes on. I'm like, Mad Max is about real practical car stunts, and there's so much of a crazy CGI overdone landscape that yeah, it's beautiful to look at and cool, but it's so far removed from the original films that it just felt like its own thing. Fury Road to me felt like its own thing. I kind of group it in there with Blade Runner 2049 in that yeah, it's a sequel in name, but it really doesn't have anything to do with the original things that supposedly inspired it. And they're both pretty much like very expensive art movies, and I think taken for that, they're fine and they're nice to look at every once in a while, but I don't think they're genius masterpieces or anything like that. I'm like, no, no. Like I've seen them a few times. They're fine for what they are. I think they have a lot of story problems, but don't even. I just distance them very far from the originals. But it did make me appreciate Thunderdome more. I've kind of come around on that. I think there's a lot of good ideas in Thunderdome. I just think the execution is not the greatest. Um, but I think the production and what happened, it definitely influenced how the film turned out for sure. And even in the development process. So there's a lot of stuff to talk about. So yeah, I think there's a lot of mileage to get out of that. Um, Yes, Ernest Thesiger is also in The Ghoul. That is correct. The really interesting 1933 British horror film. That's basically the first talking British horror film. Was thought lost for a long time. Um, MGM did a DVD here, and then but that's out of print. But you can get the network Blu-ray. It's a British Blu-ray, so it's region locked. But that's what I have. I got it for like less than $5 on Amazon UK. It was like on sale for like I think £2, like some ridiculously cheap price. It's not a great film, but it is very atmospheric. It is kind of more of the horror elements are buried in realism, and they try to do the more classical thing of explaining a lot of the horror elements away, but it has moments of striking atmosphere. Karloff has a great role as a dying Egyptologist who apparently has lives on after his death, and his very 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 terrified butler is played by Ernest Thesiger, who is gives a really great performance, unlike what we think of him in the James Whale films. So that's a really cool thing to see. And again, it was thought to be a lost film for a very long time, so it's amazing we have any version of it. So if you haven't seen it, track down that network Blu-ray. It's very cheap. Has a great Kim Newman, and I think, oh gosh, I'm blanking on his name. I think it's Stephen Jones, but I may be misremembering that. But it's got a great commentary track on it. And again, it's very cheap, but you have to have a reach and free player if you get it here in the US. Um, let's see. Oh, Pete's got a wish list of ideas for stuff for me to do. I'm always open to suggestions. My only problem is I never have enough time to squeeze in all the things I want to do. I've got a number of videos I'm working on, trying to finish the editing on some, trying to get some more stuff up for Halloween. And it's just so hard to fit in the time, let alone to then do a live stream as well and stuff. I'm always finding, oh man, I wish I could do this, and coming up with new ideas. But I'm always open to fresh ideas. So absolutely, fire away. Um, yeah, 50 sci-fi is definitely something I'm going to be doing pretty soon. Been meaning to do that for ages. Um, oh, just on George Lucas period. That's a good one. That's I should have done that already. Probably. I I know I've already covered most of my opinions on George and THX and graffiti and the non-Star Wars stuff and everything else. But yeah, I should probably just do a specific one. Uh, Luke is the fallen angel. Uh, I mean, he's not a bad guy. I think he gets so much flack thrown at him from just the fandom alone. But I, yeah, I think Kubrick put it best when he said the thing about, like, I can't understand why, such a great director just wanted to become like a business mogul. I just don't get it. And he always talks about Lucas wants to go and make those little art films. It's like, please, you can go do that. Why don't you? Like, I'll actually go see them. Um, but I think he just kind of a lot of the creativity got swallowed up by the great success. But I mean, that to a degree that happened to a lot of his contemporaries at the same time. I think you could argue some kind of got out of it, some kind of never got out of it, some kind of had one foot in and out. It just kind of depended, but it seemed to happen to that whole generation at the end of the 70s and the end of the Hollywood Renaissance period. Okay, yeah, definitely let me know any ideas. Yeah, I would like to do some stuff with Sam at Culture Dog. That would be really cool to do. I've been he and I talk all the time in the Facebook groups or Laser Just Forever or by Facebook Messenger and stuff. But yeah, I should do that. We should I don't know what sort of collaboration we do, but even just a live stream or interview chat like I did with Daisuke or something. But yeah, that would be super cool. I'll reach out to him. We should do something. That sounds cool. Um, so with that being said, I've gotten to everybody's stuff and probably should wrap things up for me tonight. So I want to say thanks every much. Wow, I can't even get my words out right. Thanks everybody for hanging out in the chat and once again, as always, letting me spiel on about some of my favorite topics. I just I just thought I should do this because James Whale is one of my great heroes. Again, not just cinematic heroes, just one of my heroes. Period. So vastly underrated and just one of those artists you encounter, who are of course long since dead once you're actually in existence and learn of their existence and their works, but just one of those artists you encounter whose work and personal life and ideas and thoughts just strike such a chord with you and become a lasting thing that you just don't forget. So that's what James Whale is like for me. That's what these films are like for me. So much of the way I feel about the Val Lewton films, for example, as well. But Whale in particular, I think, is just one of those singular artists of the cinematic medium who didn't intend to get into films, just kind of fell into it. And as Orson Welles famously said, making films is like the greatest electric train set a boy ever had. And there's not really a truer statement, I don't think. So that's how I feel about James Whale, and so that's why I wanted to talk about his works and his life a little bit and his career, and sort of expound a little bit, because last year I just talked about Universal horror in general, so I thought it'd be cool to sort of just do a separate thing on Jimmy Whale, who I love, respect, and adore forever. So with that being said, thanks for hanging out, thanks for a great chat as always. uh, Keep the classic horror spinning, cram in as much as you can, overload for Halloween. I do the same thing every year, and I'm going to be still doing it in November because I can never get it all in the month of October, though I try. Always squeezing in classic horrors into the wee hours of the morning and getting sleep deprived, and, and like having just nothing but classic horror on the brain. But that's what Halloween is for. At least it's become a real tradition for me every year, and I know for a lot of you guys as well. So um, again, thanks for hanging out. It's been wonderful to wax poetic as always. And keep tuned to the channel. Going to have a lot of extra videos coming out. And, hopefully I can get all the horror themed ones I'm working on up at least by October. So I'm gonna try a few interesting different little things in addition to the usual stuff. Got some Laserdisc updates to do as well, and a lot of other fun stuff. So as always, thanks so much, everyone, and have a better one.